My parents demanded I cancel my dream wedding and hand my luxury venue over to my entitled sister because of a sudden family emergency. Instead of begging for my place, I canceled their invitations and let them walk blindly into a trap of their own making. Their financial meltdown afterward was both pathetic and absolutely perfect. I am Melanie, 30 years old. Before I dive into exactly how I orchestrated their downfall, let me know where you are watching from in the comments below. Hit like and subscribe if you have ever had to finally cut off a toxic family member to reclaim your own life. The evening was supposed to be flawless. We were in the private dining room of one of the most exclusive restaurants in the city, surrounded by floor-to-ceiling windows that offered a panoramic view of the skyline. The room glowed with candlelight reflecting off crystal champagne flutes and silver centerpieces. This was my engagement party. Beside me sat David, my 32-year-old fiancé, a brilliant pediatric cardiothoracic surgeon who was fiercely protective of me. His family, who had traveled from out of state to be here, was everything I had ever wanted. They were warm, highly educated, and embraced me with an unconditional love that was completely foreign to me. Across the table sat my own biological family, casting a shadow over the celebration. My father Richard and my mother Patricia sat with stiff postures, offering tight, practiced smiles while quietly judging the floral arrangements. Next to them sat my 28-year-old sister Brittany, the undisputed golden child of the family. She made her living as a lifestyle influencer, treating every moment as an opportunity for brand sponsorships. Her phone was permanently glued to her hand. Beside her sat Jamal, a 31-year-old cybersecurity architect. He was a deeply intelligent, grounded man who had recently started dating my sister. He looked visibly uncomfortable with Brittany continually adjusting his posture for her social media stories. I had spent the last 2 years planning every meticulous detail of my upcoming wedding. David and I had managed to secure a booking at the Azure Estate, a legendary, highly coveted venue with sweeping coastal views, terraced gardens, and a grand ballroom. Securing a Saturday evening at the Azure took a miracle and a massive, non-refundable deposit. Tonight was supposed to be the joyful kickoff to our final countdown. Dinner was winding down. The waitstaff was clearing the plates and preparing to serve the cake. David reached under the table, finding my hand and giving it a reassuring squeeze. He leaned in, his voice barely a whisper against my ear, telling me how beautiful I looked and how he could not wait to spend the rest of his life with me. For a brief, shining moment, I felt completely at peace. Then the familiar sharp sound of a spoon clinking against crystal shattered the warmth in the room. I looked up to see my mother, Patricia, standing at her seat. The gentle hum of conversation faded away. David's parents smiled expectantly, assuming my mother was about to deliver a heartfelt toast to our future. Instead, Patricia walked past our table and confidently approached the small stage where the jazz trio had been playing. She motioned for the singer to hand over the microphone. A cold knot formed in my stomach. I knew that look on my mother's face. It was the look of a woman about to orchestrate a spectacle. "Thank you all for being here tonight," Patricia began, her voice amplified across the elegant room. "We are gathered here to celebrate love, and as a mother, there is nothing that brings me more joy than seeing my family grow. But tonight is extra special because I have the honor of sharing a true miracle with all of you." She paused dramatically, turning her body so she was completely facing Brittany's side of the table, turning her back to David and me entirely. "Brittany and Jamal are officially engaged," Patricia announced, her voice trembling with manufactured emotion. "And that is not all. They are expecting a baby. Our family is growing by one more." The private dining room plunged into a stunned, heavy silence. David stiffened beside me, his grip on my hand tightening defensively. His parents exchanged bewildered glances. This was my engagement party, a dinner David and I had paid for to celebrate our commitment. And my mother had just hijacked the entire evening to announce my sister's pregnancy and sudden engagement. "I'll go." Brittany stood up wearing a perfectly rehearsed expression of bashful surprise, waving to the silent crowd, while Jamal sat frozen, looking like he wanted the floor to swallow him whole. But Patricia was not finished. She gripped the microphone tighter, her eyes finally locking onto mine. The artificial warmth drained from her face, replaced by a calculating, authoritative stare that I recognized all too well. Because of this wonderful, unexpected blessing we are facing. A bit of a family emergency. Patricia continued, projecting her voice to ensure every single guest heard her next words. Brittany and Jamal need to get married quickly before Brittany starts showing in her wedding photos. And as an influencer, Brittany has major brand sponsors expecting a high-end luxury aesthetic for her wedding content. My heart hammered against my ribs. The air in the room felt suddenly thin. I knew exactly where this was going, but the sheer audacity of doing it publicly left me paralyzed. So Melanie, Patricia said, smiling a sharp, venomous smile, "We have made a family decision. You and David are going to transfer your wedding date and your contract for the Azure estate over to your sister. You two can easily push your wedding back a year. After all, yours is just a party, but Brittany has a delicate timeline and commercial obligations. It is the only logical solution, and as her big sister, I know you will do the right thing for our family." The silence in the room transformed from confusion to absolute suffocating horror. The waitstaff stopped moving completely. David's mother gasped audibly, placing a shaking hand over her mouth in sheer disbelief at the disrespect. My mother just stood there on the brightly lit stage microphone, gripped firmly in her hand, staring me down and waiting for my immediate compliance. She fully expected me to simply nod, to shrink myself down into nothing, and to hand over the dream I had painstakingly built and paid for simply because her golden child demanded it right then and there. The silence stretched so thin it threatened to snap. Every person in the private dining room held their breath, their eyes darting between my mother on the stage and me sitting frozen at the table. David squeezed my hand, a silent anchor grounding me to reality. His jaw was set in a tight line, his dark eyes fixed on my mother with a mixture of disbelief and quiet fury. Across the table, my father Richard crossed his arms, offering a stern nod of approval toward the stage, as if my mother had just proposed a brilliant corporate merger. Brittany sat playing the delicate, overwhelmed, expectant mother, dabbing her dry eyes with a linen napkin. They were waiting for my programmed response. For 3 decades, that response had always been surrender. They expected me to lower my head, force a tight smile, and publicly sacrifice my happiness to maintain the flawless facade of our family hierarchy. I slowly stood up from my chair. The soft rustle of my custom white silk dress seemed deafening in the quiet room. I let go of David's hand, took a steadying breath, and looked directly into my mother's expectant gaze. "No," I said. The word was not a shout. It was quiet, firm, and absolute. My mother lowered the microphone, her perfectly arched eyebrows pulling together in a sharp frown. "Excuse me," she said, her voice dropping the theatrical warmth she had used just moments before. "I must have misheard you, Melanie." "You heard me perfectly," I replied, my voice echoing clearly across the dining room. "I am not canceling my wedding. I am not giving up my date, and I am certainly not handing over the Azure estate to Brittany. You can find another venue." A collective gasp rippled through the room. My father stood up abruptly, his chair scraping violently against the polished hardwood floor. He pointed a rigid finger at me. "Melanie, do not be selfish. Your sister is in a crisis. She has brand deals and sponsors expecting a luxury event. You are just throwing a party for your friends. Do not embarrass us in front of these people." I felt a cold, sharp clarity wash over me. The lifetime of conditioning, the years of shrinking myself to fit into their narrow margins of acceptable behavior, simply vanished. "Selfish," I repeated, stepping away from the table. "You want to talk about being selfish? Let us talk about it, Dad. Let us talk about when I was 16 and you forced me to move out of my bedroom into the damp basement so Brittany could have a walk-in closet for her pageant dresses." "Melanie, that is ancient history." My mother snapped, her face flushing a deep, angry crimson. "Do not air family business in public." "You wanted an audience, Mom," I countered smoothly, gesturing to the stunned guests. "You brought the microphone. Let us give them the full story. Let us talk about my college fund. The one Grandma left specifically for me, which you both drained to pay for Brittany's failed cosmetic line and her luxury apartment downtown." You told me family helps family, and that I could just take out student loans. I paid my own way through every single semester while Brittany lived like a celebrity on my inheritance. David stood up beside me, placing a protective hand on the small of my back. His parents, sitting just inches away, looked appalled. Jamal, Brittany's fiancé, had gone completely rigid. He turned his head slowly, looking at Brittany with narrowed, calculating eyes. He was a cybersecurity architect, a man who built his career on detecting anomalies and breaches in secure systems. Right now, he was looking at his future wife like she was a massive security threat. Brittany immediately sensed the shift in Jamal's demeanor. The panic in her eyes was instantaneous. She sprang up from her chair, her lip quivering as she deployed her most reliable weapon. The tears came fast, spilling over her carefully contoured cheeks. "How can you do this to me today?" she wailed, her voice cracking with manufactured devastation. "I am pregnant, Melanie. I am vulnerable. I just wanted to share my happiness with the family, and you are trying to ruin the most important moment of my life because you are jealous. You have always been jealous of me." "I am not jealous of you, Brittany," I said, maintaining my composure, despite the adrenaline coursing through my veins. "I am just entirely done being your backup plan. I am done setting myself on fire to keep you warm. The Azure Estate is my venue. David and I paid for it. We signed the contract. You are not taking it." My father slammed his hand down on the table, making the silverware jump. "You listen to me right now," he demanded, his voice thick with rage. "You will call the venue coordinator tomorrow morning and transfer that contract. If you refuse, I will personally ensure that not a single member of our extended family attends your wedding. We will pull every ounce of financial support we promised you. We will leave you with nothing." "You have already given me nothing," I replied, my voice steady, staring him down. "Keep your money, keep your guests. I am keeping my venue." The air in the room turned electric. My mother stood frozen on the stage, her mouth slightly open, completely unmoored by the fact that her public pressure tactic had failed spectacularly. Brittany's sobbing hitched. She looked around the room, realizing that David's family was watching her with undisguised disgust. She needed to regain control of the narrative. She needed to punish me for stepping out of line. Brittany grabbed her full glass of red wine from the table and stepped toward me. Her face was a mask of tragic sorrow, tears streaming down her cheeks as she held her free hand out in a pleading gesture. "Melanie, please," she cried, walking unsteadily in her designer heels. "I just want us to be sisters. I just want us to share this." She closed the distance between us rapidly. I took a step back, but I was boxed in by our dining table. As Brittany reached me, her ankle suddenly twisted in a highly exaggerated, incredibly deliberate motion. She lunged forward. With a sharp flick of her wrist, she launched the entire contents of her crystal glass directly at my chest. The dark crimson liquid splashed violently across the bodice of my custom white silk engagement dress. The stain bloomed instantly, soaking through the delicate fabric and dripping down the skirt in jagged, horrifying streaks. The beautiful garment I had spent months designing was destroyed in less than a second. Gasps erupted from the guests. David surged forward, grabbing napkins to dab at the ruined silk, his face flushed with protective fury. His mother stood up loudly, condemning the childish display. Brittany stumbled into me, grabbing my shoulders under the guise of catching her balance. She pulled me close, her face buried near my neck, as if she were overwhelmed with clumsy horror. The entire room thought they were witnessing an unfortunate accident caused by a highly emotional pregnant woman in distress. But as her face hovered inches from my ear, the tears instantly stopped. Her breathing steadied. Brittany leaned in, her lips brushing against my ruined collar, and whispered with a vicious, triumphant smirk. "Keep the date. Mom and Dad are cutting your wedding fund to zero anyway. You will never be able to afford the final deposit without them." I shoved her away. Brittany stumbled backward, instantly adopting a look of absolute fragile terror. "Oh my God," she wailed, covering her mouth with her hands. "Melanie, I am so sorry I lost my balance. The pregnancy is making me so dizzy and clumsy." David stepped between us, his broad shoulders completely shielding me from my sister's theatrical display. He did not say a single word to her or my parents. Instead, he took off his tailored suit jacket and gently draped it over my ruined bodice. He guided me away from the table, leaving my biological family sitting in the deafening silence of the dining room. As we walked toward the exit, I did not look back. I did not shed a single tear. The cold, sticky wine seeping through the silk against my skin was a physical reminder of the toxic reality I had finally chosen to stop ignoring. The drive back to our townhouse was heavy with a thick, charged silence. David kept one hand firmly locked around mine, his knuckles white against the steering wheel. The streetlights flashed across the dashboard, illuminating the dark crimson stain peeking out from beneath his jacket. My phone resting in the center console suddenly vibrated violently against the plastic. The screen lit up with a preview of a lengthy text message from my father. I picked it up, my eyes scanning the block of text Richard had fired off while sitting at the wreckage of my engagement dinner. "Your behavior tonight was a disgrace," the message began. "You publicly humiliated your mother and your pregnant sister. You are acting like a spoiled, petulant child over a simple party venue. Let me make this perfectly clear, Melanie. Unless you transfer the Azure estate contract into Brittany's name by Monday morning, your mother and I are permanently cutting your wedding fund to zero. Furthermore, I will personally contact every single member of our extended family and ensure they boycott your selfish little gathering. You will walk down the aisle completely alone. Fix this immediately, or consider yourself cut off." I read the words twice, the venom of his ultimatum sinking in. He truly believed he held all the cards. He believed that the threat of public family shame and financial ruin would force me back into compliance. I locked the screen and tossed the phone back into the console. "What did he say?" David asked, his voice dangerously low. "He is threatening to boycott the wedding and take the whole family with him if I do not surrender the venue," I replied, staring out the window into the dark city streets. "He thinks I am bluffing." We arrived home, and David immediately set to work drawing a warm bath for me, trying to offer whatever physical comfort he could. I sat on the edge of our bed, peeling off the ruined silk dress. As the fabric hit the floor, my phone began to vibrate again. But this time it was not a single text. It was a rapid, unrelenting series of buzzes, chimes, and notification alerts overlapping in a chaotic symphony. I picked up the device. My lock screen was an absolute waterfall of notifications. Dozens of text messages from aunts, uncles, and cousins who had not spoken to me in years were flooding in. Intermixed with the texts were hundreds of Instagram and TikTok alerts. Mentions, tags, and direct messages from absolute strangers calling me a monster. My stomach plummeted. I opened social media and immediately saw why the digital world was imploding. Brittany had wasted absolutely zero time. She had posted a highly edited, heavily filtered video across all her platforms. She was sitting in the back of Jamal's car, utilizing a portable ring light to perfectly illuminate her face. Her makeup was slightly smudged, giving her the appearance of a distressed, vulnerable victim. She was clutching her flat stomach protectively, while genuine-looking tears tracked down her cheeks. The video was titled, "Storytime: How My Own Sister Viciously Ruined My Pregnancy Announcement." I pressed play, watching my sister deploy her most lucrative skill, emotional manipulation, for mass consumption. "Hi guys," Brittany whispered into the camera, her voice shaking with practiced fragility. "I did not want to bring family drama onto my platform, but I am just so broken right now. Tonight was supposed to be the happiest night of my life. I announced that Jamal and I are engaged and expecting a baby. I just wanted to share my miracle with my big sister at a family dinner." She paused to wipe a tear away, sniffling delicately into a tissue. But instead of being happy for me, my sister Melanie completely lost her mind. She screamed at me in a crowded restaurant. She told me my pregnancy was an inconvenience to her aesthetic. She was so aggressive that I got dizzy from the stress and accidentally spilled my drink. And instead of helping me, she told me she hopes my wedding is a disaster. Brittany looked directly into the lens, her eyes wide and pleading. "I am trying to plan a rushed wedding before I start showing, and all I asked was if we could use her venue date since hers is a year away. She told me my baby does not matter. I am so scared for my family right now." The video was a masterclass in gaslighting. It was a complete fabricated inversion of reality, designed specifically to activate the righteous fury of her millions of followers and our gullible extended family. I opened my text messages, watching the flying monkeys descend upon me. The cyberbullying was immediate and vicious. My Aunt Linda wrote, "I just saw Brittany's video. I cannot believe you would treat a pregnant woman with such cruelty. You are sick." My cousin Mark chimed in, "You always were a jealous brat. Give her the venue. It is the least you can do after stressing out the baby." Direct messages from Brittany's unhinged fans poured in by the hundreds. Strangers were telling me I did not deserve to get married, calling my workplace, and threatening to leave terrible reviews for David's medical practice. Brittany had weaponized her audience, aiming a digital firing squad directly at my life to force my submission. My phone burned hot in my hand as the notifications continued their relentless assault, painting me as a bitter, jealous villain in a story I never asked to be part of. I sat alone in my bedroom, watching the hateful messages multiply by the second, realizing the true magnitude of the war my family had just declared. The harsh glare of my phone screen illuminated the dark bedroom, casting long shadows against the walls as the notification counter ticked higher and higher. I watched in paralyzed silence as the digital mob tore into my character. Strangers left comments dissecting my appearance, claiming David was going to leave me once he realized how toxic I was and demanding I apologize to my pregnant sister. My own aunts and cousins, people who had watched me grow up, sent paragraph-long messages accusing me of being a bitter spinster who was trying to steal Brittany's spotlight. The cruelty was so concentrated, so expertly orchestrated by my mother and sister, that it felt hard to breathe. David stepped into the room, 2 mugs of chamomile tea in his hands. He took one look at my face, pale and illuminated by the toxic glow of the screen, and set the mugs down on the nightstand. Without asking for permission, he gently pried the phone from my rigid fingers. He scrolled for exactly 5 seconds before his jaw locked. He did not yell. He did not panic. He possessed the quiet, controlled composure of a cardiothoracic surgeon accustomed to handling life-or-death crises. He simply tapped the screen to power it down, entirely tossed it onto the bed, and pulled me into his arms. "You are not looking at that anymore," David said, his voice a low, steady rumble against my ear. "They want you to break. We are not going to let them." He stepped out into the hallway and made a single phone call. I sat on the edge of the mattress, bracing myself for the inevitable isolation I had always known. In my family, when you were the target of Patricia and Richard's wrath, you were left entirely alone until you surrendered. I fully expected to weather this storm in isolation. But I had underestimated the family I was marrying into. Within 30 minutes, the doorbell rang. I expected a fleeting visit of sympathy, maybe David's parents stopping by to drop off a card. Instead, the front door opened and a fortress walked into my living room. David's parents, Marcus and Evelyn, along with his older sister Maya, entered our home, not with pity, but with absolute tactical precision. They were a formidable team of highly educated African-American professionals, and they were ready for war. Evelyn, a retired university dean with a presence that commanded instant respect, walked straight past David and pulled me into a fierce, unconditional embrace. She smelled of vanilla and profound safety. She held me while I finally broke down, smoothing my hair and telling me that I was entirely safe, that they had me, and that no one was going to hurt me anymore. Growing up, physical affection in my household was a transactional currency doled out only when cameras were flashing or when my mother needed to perform the role of a loving parent for an audience. Sitting on my living room sofa surrounded by David's family, who asked for absolutely nothing in return, the reality of my lifetime of emotional neglect hit me with staggering force. This was what a real family looked like. They did not demand compliance, they simply offered a shield. While Evelyn grounded me, Marcus and Maya went to work. Marcus was a senior partner at a prestigious corporate law firm. He did not offer platitudes. He offered actionable strategy. He sat at our dining table, opening his leather briefcase and pulling out a yellow legal pad. He calmly explained the laws surrounding digital defamation, tortious interference, and harassment. He assured me that Brittany was walking a very dangerous, legally actionable line, by inciting a mob against David's medical practice and my personal life. Watching Marcus draft a formal cease and desist letter right there at my kitchen table, ready to deploy if the harassment escalated to physical threats, made the suffocating fear in my chest evaporate. Maya, a senior public relations executive, took control of the digital fallout with brutal efficiency. She asked for my phone and my passwords, treating the situation like a corporate crisis management campaign. With lightning speed, she locked down all my social media accounts, making everything private and filtering out unknown contacts. She blocked every single family member who had sent a hateful message, severing their access to me completely. She meticulously documented and reported Brittany's highly edited storytime video for targeted harassment, initiating a takedown review with the platform. "They are bullies," Melanie Maya said, her eyes flashing with protective fire as she deleted another batch of vitriolic comments. "Bullies thrive on access and audience. We are cutting off their access to you, and we are stripping them of their audience. You do not owe these people a single explanation." The storm of public shame that Brittany and my parents had banked on to crush my spirit was completely neutralized by a wall of competence and fierce, unconditional love. For the next 2 days, I existed in a bubble of absolute peace. I did not look at a single screen. Evelyn stayed with me while David was at the hospital brewing fresh tea and talking to me about her own wedding 30 years ago, deliberately steering the conversation away from the toxicity of my biological relatives. I felt a sense of grounding I had never experienced. My biological parents had cut my wedding fund to zero, believing they had trapped me. But sitting in my kitchen eating a home-cooked meal prepared by Evelyn, I realized they had not trapped me at all. They had effectively cut me free. It was late Tuesday morning. The digital noise had been silenced, and I was finally breathing normally again. I was sitting at the kitchen island reviewing some work documents when my personal cell phone buzzed. It was a number I had bypassed from the social media lockdown, a direct line I needed to keep open. The caller ID displayed the main office of the Azure estate. I answered, expecting a routine check-in regarding the catering menu or a floral delivery schedule. Instead, the voice on the other end belonged to Eleanor Vance, the executive director of the venue, and she sounded remarkably tense. "Ma'am, your parents are in our lobby with a lawyer," she said, her voice dropping to an urgent, hushed whisper. "They are threatening to sue us to forcefully transfer your venue contract into Brittany's name." The Portland rain lashed against the floor-to-ceiling windows of my sleek, high-rise corporate office downtown. I stood behind my massive mahogany desk, looking out over the gray city skyline, the phone pressed tightly against my ear. The transition from the shattered, weeping sister in the restaurant to the ice-cold executive standing in this room was absolute. This office, with its minimalist leather furniture, abstract art, and commanding view of the financial district, was my true domain. For 30 years, my family had drastically underestimated me. They viewed me as the quiet, manageable daughter, the one who existed simply to provide a contrasting background to Brittany's radiant spotlight. They assumed my career was some mid-level, insignificant desk job that barely paid the bills. They never bothered to ask about my work, never inquired about my promotions, and never dug into the specifics of my financial independence. Because of their blinding arrogance, they possessed absolutely no idea who they were dealing with. They did not know that 2 years ago I had founded a luxury hospitality holding firm. They did not know that from this very office I managed a highly lucrative portfolio of the most exclusive event properties on the coast. And they certainly did not know that my firm had purchased the Azure estate in a private multi-million-dollar acquisition. I was not just a bride holding a reservation at the Azure. I was the anonymous founder, the CEO, and the sole owner of the entire property. And right now, Eleanor Vance, the executive director of the Azure, was on the line sounding genuinely distressed. She was a consummate professional, unaccustomed to dealing with hostile relatives staging a coup in her elegant reception area. "They are claiming breach of a verbal family agreement," Eleanor stammered over the line, the background noise of the estate faintly audible. "Your father is shouting at the concierge. The lawyer is threatening to file an injunction to freeze the date entirely so no one can use it." "Melanie," I can call our private security team and have them physically removed for trespassing right now. Just give me the word and they are gone. I closed my eyes, letting the quiet authority of my office center me. A slow, chilling smile spread across my face. I could clearly picture my father Richard standing in the grand marble-floored lobby of the Azure Red in the face waving papers and making demands. Beside him, my mother would be clutching her designer purse, projecting an aura of aggrieved entitlement. They had actively marched down to my venue on a Tuesday morning, armed with legal counsel, intending to bully a premier hospitality estate into breaking a legally binding contract for their golden child. The irony was so rich it was almost intoxicating. "Do not call security, Eleanor," I said, my voice dropping to a smooth, icy register that demanded absolute obedience. "I want you to treat them with the utmost respect. In fact, I want you to offer them premium coffee, escort them into the executive boardroom, and listen to every single word their lawyer has to say." Eleanor paused, her confusion evident through the receiver. "Ma'am, are you entirely sure they are demanding we cancel your event? They want to put the contract entirely in Brittany's name for the exact same weekend." "I am absolutely sure," I replied, pacing slowly across the thick carpet of my office. I was no longer the wounded daughter. I was operating strictly as a chief executive dealing with a hostile takeover. "I want you to play along completely. Tell them that while a standard transfer is against corporate policy, the estate does offer a specialized loophole for high-profile clients facing emergencies. Tell them they qualify for the VIP priority transfer contract." I could hear the slow realization dawning on Eleanor. The VIP priority transfer contract was not a standard document. It was a heavily guarded premium service tier designed specifically for elite corporate clients or celebrities who needed to commandeer a venue on extremely short notice, bypassing all waitlists. Because it required the estate to completely halt other operations, reallocate premier staff, and absorb the liability of a rushed timeline, the premium was astronomical. "You want me to offer them the VIP tier?" Eleanor asked, her voice dropping to an odd whisper. "Melanie, the markup on that contract is brutal." "I know exactly what the markup is," I stated flatly, stopping to look at my reflection in the dark glass of the window. The standard venue fee David and I paid was already significant. The VIP priority transfer contract will cost them exactly 3 times that original price. It is a completely separate expedited fee structure. Present it to them as an exclusive, highly prestigious option. Play directly to my mother's ego. Tell her that this tier is usually reserved for A-list influencers and celebrities, and that it will guarantee Brittany the most lavish, highly prioritized service the estate can possibly provide. Make them feel like they are winning an exclusive prize. There was a moment of silence on the line as Eleanor processed the sheer gravity of the directive. "If they sign this," she began carefully, "the financial commitment is immediate and non-negotiable. They will have to provide proof of funds and wire the entire balance within 48 hours to secure the date." "That is exactly the point, Eleanor," I said, walking back to my desk and trailing my fingers across the polished wood. "My father just threatened to cut my wedding fund to 0. He thinks he holds the absolute financial leverage. He thinks he can bully his way into a luxury venue for free, simply by screaming loud enough. Let him see the actual cost of his golden child's demands. To afford a bill that massive, Richard and Patricia will have to completely liquidate their retirement savings. They will have to drain every single account they possess to buy a venue they think they are stealing from me." I gave Eleanor her final instructions, mapping out exactly how the trap would be laid. The contract was to be presented as a massive favor, a prestigious rescue mission for Brittany's delicate situation. I knew my parents. I knew their crippling obsession with image and status. If Eleanor pitched the contract as an elite VIP experience that would elevate Brittany's influencer brand, they would not even read the fine print. They would be so blinded by the victory of taking my date and securing an exclusive tier that they would gleefully sign their financial ruin into existence. "Understood," Eleanor said, her professional tone fully restored, underscored with a hint of lethal efficiency. I will escort them to the boardroom now and have the legal team draft the VIP transfer immediately. I will make sure they feel like absolute royalty. Do that, I replied. And, Eleanor, make sure their lawyer gets a very good look at the final billing total. I want to know exactly how loud my father gasps. I ended the call and set the phone down on my desk. The war they had started in that private dining room had just shifted to a battlefield they did not even know existed. They wanted to take my venue, my date, and my joy. I was going to let them have the paperwork, but it was going to cost them everything they had ever worked for. The silence in my office was absolute, save for the rhythmic drumming of the rain against the floor-to-ceiling glass. I sat perfectly still in my high-backed leather chair, my eyes fixed on the digital clock on my desktop monitor. Every passing minute was another step toward my family's self-imposed financial destruction. I did not need to be physically present at the Azure estate to watch the trap snap shut. I could visualize the entire scene with surgical precision. My father Richard was a man whose ego was his greatest vulnerability. Give him a perceived victory rapid in exclusivity, and he would blindly march into an inferno. Eleanor Vance was executing my directives flawlessly. Through our encrypted corporate messaging system, she sent me brief, sterile updates. They are in the boardroom. The lawyer is reviewing the VIP priority transfer addendum. They are balking at the final sum. I waited, taking a slow sip of my black coffee. I knew the hesitation would be temporary. Patricia and Richard were currently staring at an invoice that demanded 3 times the standard premium rate of a high-season weekend at the Azure. The number would be astronomical, a figure that would force my father to make frantic calls to his broker, draining accounts he had spent decades building. Another message materialized on my screen from Eleanor. The mother is pushing him to sign. She says Brittany needs this for her brand. I smiled, a cold, humorless smile. Of course she was. In Patricia's eyes, the exorbitant cost was simply proof of how elite and untouchable her golden child truly was. She would happily set her own future on fire just to ensure Brittany looked good in the ashes. 10 minutes later, the final update arrived. Funds have been wired. The contract is signed. The date is locked. I let out a long, slow breath. The deed was done. What Richard and his overpriced lawyer had failed to process in their desperate rush to secure a victory was the bedrock of the VIP priority transfer agreement. Embedded deep within the sleek gold-embossed pages of that exclusive contract was an ironclad, non-negotiable, 100% no-refund clause under any circumstances. It did not matter if the wedding was canceled, delayed, or ruined by an act of God. It did not matter if Brittany changed her mind, or if Jamal finally came to his senses and walked away. The moment that wire transfer cleared, the money belonged to my holding company forever. My parents had just purchased a single weekend of glory at the cost of their entire retirement safety net, and they had absolutely no way to ever get it back. I turned my attention away from my computer monitors and picked up my personal cell phone. While Maya had expertly locked down all my social media accounts to shield me from the digital mob, I had instructed her to leave my access to the main family group chat open. I needed a direct line of sight into their hubris. I did not have to wait long. The screen illuminated with a flurry of incoming messages. The group chat, ironically named Family First, was suddenly exploding with activity. I opened the thread and was immediately greeted by a high-resolution photograph. It was a picture of Richard and Patricia standing in the opulent sunlit lobby of the Azure estate. My father was puffing his chest out, a look of profound, arrogant triumph plastered across his face. In his hands, he held the thick leather-bound VIP portfolio containing the venue contract. Patricia stood beside him, clutching her designer handbag, smiling like she had just conquered a small nation. Beneath the photograph, my father had typed a caption that made my blood run ice cold. I just secured justice for Brittany. The responses from the extended family poured in like toxic sludge. Aunt Linda sent a string of clapping emojis, adding, "Thank God someone in this family knows how to protect our precious pregnant girl." Cousin Mark chimed in with, "A real father steps up." Melanie could learn a lot from this. It was a nauseating echo chamber of enablers, all congratulating my parents for successfully bullying a corporation and stealing what they believed was my dream wedding venue. They were celebrating the ultimate punishment, reveling in the fact that they had forcefully put me back in my designated place as the lesser sacrificial daughter. I stared at the messages, but the familiar ache of rejection never came. The lifelong desperation for their approval, the deep-seated need to be seen and valued by the people who brought me into this world had been completely eradicated. In its place was a solid, impenetrable wall of indifference. I was no longer the wounded child hiding in the damp basement while her sister played princess. I was the architect of their ruin, and they were cheering as the walls caved in on them. I tapped the text box at the bottom of the screen. I did not type a paragraph defending myself. I did not explain that I owned the very venue they had just bankrupted themselves to secure. They did not deserve the satisfaction of an argument, nor did they deserve the courtesy of a warning. They deserved exactly what they had asked for. My fingers flew across the digital keyboard, crafting the final words I would ever speak to my biological family. Since you enjoyed stealing my wedding day, you and Brittany are officially uninvited from my life. I hit send. I watched the tiny blue bubble appear at the bottom of the long chain of their hateful congratulations. I did not wait to see the read receipts. I did not wait for the inevitable explosion of outraged replies or the frantic phone calls that would follow. With surgical precision, I tapped the settings icon in the top right corner of the chat. I selected my father's contact and hit block. I moved to my mother, blocking her instantly. I scrolled down to Brittany, severing the connection without a fraction of a second of hesitation. I continued down the line, systematically blocking Aunt Linda, Cousin Mark, and every single flying monkey who had participated in their digital firing squad. In less than 2 minutes, the purge was complete. A profound, heavy silence settled over my office, matching the stillness in my chest. The toxic noise that had dictated my entire existence was gone. I set the phone face down on the polished mahogany desk, turning my chair back toward the window to watch the rain wash the city clean. The quiet rhythm of my new life was a stark, beautiful contrast to the chaotic noise I had left behind. In the weeks following the digital purge, a profound and unshakable peace had settled over our home. No passive-aggressive text messages pinged my phone. No guilt-tripping voicemails clogged my inbox. David and I continued planning our actual wedding, shifting our vision to a secluded, breathtaking botanical garden owned by a close friend. We left the Azure estate entirely to its newest and most financially compromised clients. My firm had processed my parents' massive non-refundable VIP premium, and I went back to being a chief executive entirely detached from their impending disaster. It was a brisk Tuesday afternoon when our protective bubble was unexpectedly breached. I had brought lunch to David's hospital, carrying 2 thermoses of roasted red pepper soup to his department's break room. I was sitting at a small table in the sunlit, glass-walled atrium, waiting for him to finish consulting on a post-operative patient. The smell of sterile antiseptic and roasted coffee beans mingled in the air. A shadow fell across my table. I looked up expecting to see David in his scrubs. Instead, I found Jamal standing there. Brittany's fiancé looked entirely different from the relaxed, beaming man who had proposed in that private dining room. His usually immaculate posture was slouched, and dark, heavy bags underscored his eyes. He wore a rumpled trench coat over a high-end suit that looked as if he had slept in it. The calculating gaze he leveled at me was razor-sharp, stripped of all polite social pretense. He looked like a man who had not rested in days. "Melanie," Jamal said, his voice flat and exhausted. "I need to talk to you, and I needed to do it somewhere your parents could not intercept me." I slowly set down my coffee cup. I had no quarrel with Jamal. As far as I knew, he was just another prop in my sister's meticulously curated aesthetic, a handsome, successful accessory to complete her influencer brand. I gestured to the empty chair opposite me. He sat down heavily, leaning forward with his elbows on his knees, aggressively rubbing his temples. "I did not come here to ask you to make peace with Brittany," he stated immediately correctly, reading my guarded expression. "I came here because my entire life is currently flashing red, and you are the only person who actually knows the underlying source code of that family." I leaned back, crossing my arms. I am listening. I am a cybersecurity architect, Melanie Jamal continued, his tone shifting into the precise clinical register of a man diagnosing a massive system breach. My entire career is built on detecting anomalies. I look for the microscopic inconsistencies that prove a secure network has been compromised. For the past 3 weeks, your sister has been throwing up more red flags than a zero-day exploit. He looked around the hospital atrium to ensure no one was listening closely. When I first met Brittany, she and your parents painted a very specific picture. They projected the image of established generational wealth. Richard always talked about his expansive portfolio. Patricia dropped names of elite country clubs as if they owned them. Brittany played the part of the affluent heiress flawlessly, seamlessly, sliding into my own financial bracket. She told me the wedding was completely covered by a family trust fund. She said securing the Azure estate was a sudden miraculous family gift and showed me a screenshot of a wire transfer receipt for the venue deposit to prove her parents were handling it. I kept my expression carefully neutral. I knew exactly how that venue had been secured, and I knew the ruinous VIP contract my parents had blindly signed. Because they had poured every cent of their liquid assets into that non-refundable venue fee to spite me, I knew there was no money left for the actual wedding. No catering, no flowers, no entertainment. I handle my own secure servers at home for my consulting work, Jamal said, his jaw tightening. I use military-grade encryption. Last week I caught a notification on a dormant monitoring app. Someone had bypassed a secondary firewall on my personal desktop. It was an inside job. It was Brittany. The air between us grew cold. She was not snooping for text messages, was she? I asked quietly. No, Jamal stated, the betrayal hardening his features into stone. She was not looking for passwords to my social media. She was looking for my social security number, my tax documents, and my primary banking credentials. I initiated a deep sweep of my own credit report, bypassing the standard consumer channels and going directly into the raw data bureaus. Jamal took a ragged, shaky breath. Melanie. She lied about the generational wealth. I ran a quiet background check on Richard and Patricia after I found the breach. They completely liquidated their retirement accounts 3 weeks ago. Every single penny is gone. They are practically destitute. But worse than that, your sister has been committing active identity theft. She has been secretly opening credit cards in my name. She bypassed my credit freezes using the answers to my security questions, which she memorized from our conversations. The sheer criminal audacity of it made my stomach plummet. How much, I asked. $85,000 in the last 3 weeks alone, Jamal replied, his voice a volatile mixture of fury and disbelief. She maxed out 3 phantom cards to pay for luxury vendors. A celebrity floral designer, a custom imported silk gown, a 10-piece string quartet, and a high-end videography team. Because your parents went broke buying the venue, she had no way to pay for the actual event. So she used my stolen identity to fund a 6-figure aesthetic to impress her millions of followers, all while smiling in my face and telling me her daddy was footing the bill. I stared at the man sitting across from me. My family's toxicity was no longer just an emotional drain. It had mutated into active criminal destruction. Jamal had bypassed the digital noise and dug straight down to the rotting core of the family dynamic. He had uncovered the brutal truth that Richard and Patricia were financially ruined, and that Brittany was willing to commit federal offenses just to maintain her flawless influencer facade. Jamal looked at me, a man standing on the precipice of a devastating realization. I froze the accounts and flagged the fraud division this morning, he said, his eyes burning with cold intensity. The vendors are going to get chargebacks and the wedding is going to implode. I just needed to look you in the eye and ask you one question. Are they really this insane? They are not just insane, Jamal, I replied softly, feeling the absolute weight of the truth settling between us. They are empty, and they will consume anyone around them just to keep up the illusion that they are full. Jamal nodded slowly, processing the finality of my words. He stood up from the table, buttoning his trench coat. The exhaustion seemed to bleed out of him, replaced by a terrifying absolute resolve. He did not look like a heartbroken groom anymore. He looked like an executioner. "Thank you, Melanie," he said quietly. "I am going back to the townhouse now to pack my things. But before I leave, I am going to let Brittany know exactly what happens to hackers who try to breach my system." "Wait," I said, my voice cutting cleanly through the sterile hum of the hospital atrium, just as he turned his back. "Sit back down, Jamal. You only have half the source code." Jamal paused, his hand gripping the edge of his trench coat. He looked at me, his eyes narrowing as he assessed whether I was simply stalling or offering genuine intelligence. Slowly, the fight seemed to drain out of his posture. He pulled his chair back out and sat down, fixing me with that same piercing, analytical stare. "What else is there to know? She stole my identity. Your parents are broke. The wedding is a sham. You know they liquidated their retirement to steal my wedding date at the Azure estate?" I began, folding my hands neatly on the tabletop. "And you know Brittany maxed out fraudulent credit cards to furnish the event because the venue deposit bled them dry. But you do not know who holds the venue contract." He frowned, a deep crease appearing between his brows. "The Azure corporate office holds the contract. My holding firm holds the contract," I corrected, keeping my tone entirely conversational. "I am the anonymous founder and sole owner of the Azure estate. I bought it 2 months ago in a private acquisition." I watched the shock ripple across his exhausted face, fracturing his rigid composure. His eyes widened as the sheer scale of the manipulation fell into place. Jamal was a man who built secure systems for a living, and he was currently looking at the architect of a flawless, devastating digital snare. He blinked, processing the data faster than a standard civilian would. When my father marched into that lobby with his lawyer, I continued smoothly, demanding they cancel my reservation and transfer the date to Brittany. My executive director called me. I instructed her to offer them a highly specialized, heavily guarded, VIP priority transfer agreement. I priced it at exactly 3 times the standard seasonal rate. I knew my parents. I knew they would be so blinded by the prestige and the absolute victory of defeating me that they would not even glance at the fine print. That contract contains an ironclad, non-negotiable 100% no-refund clause. The moment their wire transfer hit my corporate accounts, their entire life savings became my property. There is no loophole. There is no legal recourse. They bought a date and they bankrupted themselves to do it. Jamal stared at me, the silence stretching out between us. The heavy rain battered the glass ceiling high above our heads. "You bankrupted your own parents," he stated, not with horror, but with a profound, almost reverent awe. "They bankrupted themselves," I corrected firmly. "I simply provided the paperwork. But you need to understand why they did it, and why Brittany did what she did to you. You are looking for a logical motive in a system built entirely on toxic delusion." I laid all my cards on the table. For the next 20 minutes, I systematically dismantled the facade of the family he had almost married into. I detailed the absolute crippling reality of their dynamic. I explained the golden child syndrome, how Patricia and Richard had spent 3 decades enabling Brittany's worst impulses while actively punishing my independence. I told him how they viewed success, not as something earned through hard work, but as a birthright that Brittany was inherently owed. I explained their crippling debt, their obsession with maintaining a wealthy aesthetic on a middle-class salary, and how anyone who stood in their way was deemed a hostile enemy to be crushed. "She did not steal your identity because she panicked Jamal," I told him, leaning forward to ensure every single word registered. "She did not do it out of momentary desperation because my parents ran out of cash. She did it because in her mind, your money is her money. Your credit is her credit. You are not a partner to her. You are a resource. You are a highly functional, lucrative asset designed to fund the influencer lifestyle she believes she deserves. My parents raised her to believe the rules do not apply to her. She stole your identity to buy celebrity florists and custom silk gowns because maintaining her digital aesthetic for her followers is the only thing she actually cares about. If you go back to that townhouse right now and confront her, she will cry. She will panic. She will manipulate you, blame the stress of the pregnancy, or claim she was doing it all to make you proud. Jamal's hands were clenched into tight fists on the tabletop. His knuckles were bone white. She will try to spin the narrative, he muttered, his mind already mapping out the variables. She will run to social media, play the victim, and try to isolate my assets before the fraud division can fully lock down the compromised accounts. Exactly, I said. If you cancel the vendors today, she will twist it. She will tell the world her cruel fiancé abandoned her and left her with nothing. You know how her followers mobilize online. They will attempt to destroy your professional reputation. My parents will back her up, claiming you financially abused her and left a pregnant woman stranded. I watched Jamal process the raw data. He was a brilliant man, and I could see the exact moment the hot, volatile anger inside him cooled into absolute freezing ice. The emotional betrayal was still there, raw and bleeding, but it was being swiftly encased in a shell of pure, predatory logic. He was no longer a wounded groom reeling from a broken heart. He was a cybersecurity expert isolating a malicious virus. I fully expected him to ask for my help to shut the event down. I expected him to pull out his phone, call his legal team, and demand the immediate arrest of my sister. Instead, he took a slow, deep breath, smoothing the lapels of his rumpled coat. He sat back in his chair, his posture shifting from defeated exhaustion to an intimidating, coiled stillness. You are right, Jamal said, his voice dropping to a terrifyingly calm register. If I confront her in private, she controls the fallout. She controls the digital spin. A quiet cancellation gives her the shadows she needs to escape accountability. He looked at me, a dark, lethal smile touching the corners of his mouth. It was a smile that promised absolute devastation. We do not cancel the vendors, Jamal stated softly. We do not shut down the wedding. We let her keep the celebrity florist. We let her keep the custom silk gown and the imported string quartet. We let her invite every single one of her high-profile influencer friends and all of your toxic relatives. I raised an eyebrow, genuinely surprised by the pivot. You want to let the wedding happen? Let her climb to the very top, Jamal said, his eyes locking onto mine with a chilling, unmistakable finality. I'll be at that wedding, but only to repossess everything she stole from me. Jamal's vow hung in the heavy air, transforming the sterile hospital atrium into a war room. I looked at this man, previously just a handsome backdrop to my sister's insatiable vanity, and saw a formidable, dangerous ally. We shook hands, a silent pact forged in the fires of mutual betrayal, before he turned and walked out into the pouring rain. The countdown to absolute destruction had officially begun. The next few weeks were a masterclass in grotesque, unadulterated excess. Unaware of the financial guillotine suspended perfectly above her neck, Brittany threw herself into the role of the triumphant bride. My encrypted alerts from the Azure Estates management software kept me apprised of her every logistical move, but I barely needed them. Brittany was broadcasting her stolen victory across every digital platform available to the public. She launched a dedicated wedding hashtag and posted daily video updates documenting her luxury vendor meetings. She shamelessly flaunted the celebrity florist, the imported silk gown, and the extravagant catering menus, all of which were currently being funded by the stolen identity of the man she was preparing to marry. She even had the audacity to post a tearful video claiming she had overcome intense family jealousy to secure her dream venue, painting herself as the persevering victim of my supposed bitterness. Then came the physical manifestations of her towering hubris. Brittany was not satisfied with a traditional audience. She demanded a stadium for her coronation. She commissioned custom, incredibly heavy cardstock invitations, dripping in genuine gold foil embossed with a pretentious, fabricated family crest she had designed herself. These were not simply mailed in standard envelopes. They were delivered in miniature velvet boxes by private couriers. She did not just send these to our extended family and her sycophantic friends. Treating her wedding like a celebrity gala, she mailed them to local media outlets, lifestyle bloggers, and high-profile influencers across the city. She was actively begging for press coverage, constructing a massive, highly public pedestal from which her inevitable fall would be spectacular. Her arrogance reached its absolute peak when a courier arrived at my corporate headquarters downtown. My executive assistant brought the thick, velvet-lined box into my office with a confused expression. It was addressed to me, adorned in aggressive looping calligraphy. Inside, resting on a bed of crushed silk, was the gold-foiled invitation to the very event she had stolen from me at the venue she believed she had wrested from my grasp. Accompanying the ostentatious card was a handwritten note on expensive perfumed stationery. I held it up to the light, tracing the raised gold lettering with my thumb. The note read, "Just in case you wanted to see what a real fairy tale looks like, try not to be too bitter." The sheer delusion was almost magnificent. She was inviting the sister she had ruthlessly betrayed to sit in the audience and applaud her stolen glory. I did not feel a shred of anger. I felt nothing but the cold clinical observation of a doomed subject. I tossed the heavy cardstock and the velvet box directly into the industrial paper shredder beside my desk, listening to the satisfying, aggressive hum of the blades destroying her expensive taunt. She wanted a highly publicized fairy tale. Jamal and I were going to give her a televised tragedy. While Brittany busied herself constructing a very public circus, David and I quietly orchestrated our actual celebration. I had gladly surrendered the main grounds and the grand ballroom of the Azure estate to the impending disaster, but I had absolutely no intention of letting my family rob me of my joy or my wedding date. When my holding firm acquired the Azure, the purchase included a heavily guarded, densely forested acreage completely hidden behind the main property walls. Nestled deep within that restricted, unseen zone was a structure known only as the Royal Pavilion. It was a hyper-exclusive, ultra-private sanctuary initially built by a reclusive billionaire decades ago. Surrounded by ancient weeping willows and protected by state-of-the-art security systems, the pavilion was an architectural masterpiece of black steel expansive glass conservatories and cascading indoor waterfalls. It was completely off-limits to the public. It did not appear on any of the Azure's marketing brochures or websites. It was not available for rent at any price. It was a secret jewel reserved solely for my holding firm's absolute highest tier of private dignitaries. And now it was the venue for my wedding. While Brittany loudly demanded the attention of strangers in the main estate, David and I would be exchanging our vows just a few hundred yards away, completely shielded by an impenetrable fortress of nature and privacy. We redirected our intimate guest list, entirely composed of true friends and David's loving, supportive family, to the concealed, unmarked access road leading directly to the pavilion. Our vendors, seasoned professionals who respected privacy and genuine elegance, were sworn to absolute secrecy. David was entirely on board with the pivot. He detested the toxic spectacle my family had created and was deeply relieved that we were stepping away from the main estate. We worked closely with Eleanor Vance to ensure that the staff assigned to the Royal Pavilion was entirely separate from the crew managing the main house. We were effectively creating two parallel universes operating on the exact same day. One was destined for a beautiful, serene union of two people who genuinely loved each other. The other was an elaborate, heavily funded trap destined for a spectacular implosion. Everything was perfectly aligned. The dual timelines were locked in place. On the scheduled Saturday, the grand iron gates of the Azure estate would open to welcome the local media, the flock of aspiring influencers, and my bankrupt, oblivious parents to the wedding of the century. They would step into the grand foyer expecting an untouchable triumph. Meanwhile, safely tucked away in our pristine, hidden sanctuary, David and I would finally have our perfect day. The board was set. All that was left was to let the golden child walk down the aisle and meet the groom who was waiting to burn her fraudulent kingdom to the ground. The final countdown began with two starkly different realities colliding in the same temporal space, separated only by a few hundred yards of restricted, heavily forested estate grounds. On the public stage of the internet, my sister was orchestrating a manic, high-gloss performance. To her millions of followers, the impending nuptials were a flawless march toward a lavish fairy tale pinnacle. But through the encrypted, highly detailed reports from Eleanor Vance and my own understanding of Jamal's digital warfare, I watched the structural integrity of Britney's event rapidly and violently disintegrate. Jamal had made good on his promise with ruthless efficiency. The moment he initiated the fraud protocols and froze his compromised financial accounts, the massive chargebacks hit Britney's luxury vendors like a tidal wave. The celebrity floral designer, discovering a newly bounced deposit, had threatened to pull the entire custom archway unless a wire transfer cleared immediately. The imported string quartet demanded cash upfront, refusing to set foot on the property without it. The elite videography team placed a hard hold on their services, citing fraudulent billing activity. Panic, raw and unadulterated, began to bleed through the cracks of the Golden Child's carefully curated facade. Patricia and Richard, having completely annihilated their retirement savings just to secure the non-refundable venue date, were entirely useless. They possessed absolutely no liquid assets to stop the bleeding. Britney was trapped in a relentless, agonizing scramble, secretly opening high-interest microloans and begging obscure sponsors for last-minute bailouts just to keep the vendors from walking out. Her days were a frantic, caffeine-fueled nightmare of damage control, hiding her escalating terror behind perfectly filtered video updates and the pristine gold-foiled invitations she had so arrogantly mailed to the press. Meanwhile, my reality existed in a state of absolute untroubled tranquility. The Royal Pavilion was a masterclass in quiet luxury, completely insulated from the desperate, debt-fueled chaos unfolding on the main grounds of the estate. While Britney was busy screaming at florists over blocked credit cards, I was standing in the center of a glass-walled conservatory surrounded by ancient weeping willows, sipping a flute of vintage champagne. My final dress fitting was an exercise in pure peace. There were no cameras, no lighting rigs, and no frantic need to broadcast my joy to strangers. David sat on a plush velvet sofa nearby, his eyes warm and steady, offering quiet compliments as the tailor made microscopic adjustments to the simple, elegant lines of my gown. We spent our evenings walking through the restricted gardens of the pavilion, the only sound the gentle cascade of the indoor waterfalls and the rustle of leaves in the night air. The vendors we had selected operated with flawless, invisible efficiency. Everything was paid for, every detail secured by professionals who valued discretion over publicity. We were not staging a theatrical production to appease an audience of strangers. We were preparing for a marriage. The profound contrast between the two events was poetic. My biological family was fighting a losing, terrifying battle against financial ruin, just to put on a play while I was resting comfortably in the reality they had tried so hard to steal from me. The dichotomy reached its breaking point exactly 3 days before the wedding. I was seated at the mahogany desk in my corporate office, finalizing a few routine acquisitions before officially signing off for my wedding weekend. My personal cell phone vibrated against the polished wood, the screen illuminated with an unknown, unregistered local number. Given my strict digital block on all family contacts, I normally would have ignored it, assuming it was a spam caller. But a distinct intuitive chill crawled up my spine. I knew exactly what this was. I picked up the device and accepted the call, remaining perfectly silent. Melanie. The voice snapped sharp and laced with an incredible, blinding entitlement. It was my mother. She was calling from a cheap prepaid burner phone, having clearly realized her primary number, along with the rest of the families, had been permanently exiled from my network. I leaned back in my leather chair, letting the silence stretch out, forcing her to fill the empty space with her own desperation. "Listen to me," Patricia continued, her tone adopting that familiar patronizing edge she always used when attempting to command a disobedient child. "I know you are throwing a tantrum. I know you are feeling bitter and slighted because your sister is getting the grand event you could never pull off. But you are still family, and family supports each other. You need to drop this ridiculous silent treatment right now." I could hear the underlying strain in her voice, the faint, high-pitched tremor of a woman whose financial world was actively collapsing around her. She was trying to project absolute authority while standing on the deck of a sinking ship. She had no money, her daughter was facing imminent exposure for identity theft, and the entire high society event was held together by maxed-out credit and lies. Yet she still believed she held the upper hand. "Brittany is stressed enough as it is. My mother demanded, the arrogance bleeding heavily through her panic. She needs her sister. You need to show up to hold your sister's train as a bridesmaid. Don't be bitter. The sheer, unfathomable audacity of the demand was a masterpiece of narcissistic delusion. They had stolen my venue, drained their life savings to hurt me, and were currently drowning in fraudulent debt. Yet Patricia still fully expected me to fall to my knees, put on a matching dress, and serve as a silent, subservient prop to make Brittany look good. They genuinely believed I was sitting in my apartment weeping over my lost date, completely unaware of the absolute authority I held over their impending destruction. They thought the game was over, and that they had won. I did not raise my voice. I did not unleash the anger that had once dictated my youth. I spoke with the icy, lethal precision of a chief executive terminating a hostile entity. Read the exact address on your contract very carefully. I pulled the phone away from my ear and severed the connection, dropping the device face down onto my desk. Saturday morning broke with the kind of blinding, crystalline sunshine that bridal magazines promised, but nature rarely delivered. It was a day practically engineered for a masterpiece. From the tranquil glass-enclosed bridal suite of the Royal Pavilion, I sat in a plush armchair holding a steaming cup of Earl Grey tea. My hair was pinned up, the makeup artist had just begun her work, and the environment was an oasis of hushed, respectful calm. Resting on the marble vanity in front of me was a secure encrypted tablet, streaming the live high-definition feed from the Azure Estate's main entry gates. I tapped the screen, unmuting the audio just in time for the opening act. At precisely 10 o'clock, a grotesque spectacle rolled up the winding manicured driveway leading to the primary estate. It was a stretch limousine of absurd proportions, a hulking white monstrosity that looked utterly ridiculous against the refined historical elegance of the venue's surrounding landscape. This was Brittany's grand entrance. She was not arriving quietly to prepare, she was arriving to conquer. Through the high-resolution security lenses, I watched the doors of the obnoxious vehicle swing open. A flock of bridesmaids spilled out onto the cobblestone driveway, looking identical in tightly corseted blush-pink satin. They were immediately followed by a swarm of minor internet personalities and lifestyle bloggers Brittany had relentlessly courted. The influencers swarmed like locusts, holding up smartphones on stabilizing gimbals, their portable ring lights glaring unnecessarily in the bright morning sun. They were broadcasting the arrival to thousands of viewers, narrating the supposed triumph of Brittany's highly publicized fairy tale wedding. Finally, Brittany herself emerged. She was draped in the stolen silk gown, a breathtaking custom-tailored creation that she had fraudulently charged to Jamal's rapidly imploding credit lines. She paused at the edge of the limousine, striking a practiced artificial pose for the cameras surrounding her. Her smile was blinding, a perfect mask of victory. She believed she had won. She believed she was about to step through the towering wrought iron gates of the Azure Estate and take her rightful place upon the throne she had purchased with my parents' bankruptcy and her fiancé's stolen identity. She expected a royal welcome. She expected a brigade of white-gloved valets rushing forward to assist with her heavy train concierges bowing in deference and a team of coordinators offering flutes of imported champagne. She expected the doors of the main manor to be thrown open in total submission to her aesthetic vision. Instead, the massive iron gates remained firmly, resolutely shut. There were no valets. There was no champagne. There was only a solid, unmoving line of heavily armed private tactical security. I watched as 6 men in immaculate dark suits equipped with discreet earpieces and an unmistakable air of lethal professionalism stepped smoothly out from the shadow of the gatehouse. They formed an impenetrable human barricade across the cobblestone entrance. Their posture was rigid, their expressions completely devoid of the fawning subservience Brittany was accustomed to. They were not there to welcome a bride. They were there to secure a perimeter. The sudden jarring halt to the procession caused immediate confusion among the entourage. The influencers lowered their gimbals slightly, their live stream commentaries trailing off into bewildered whispers. Brittany's triumphant smile faltered, replaced by a sharp, highly irritated frown. She gestured wildly to my mother, who was emerging from the rear of the limousine, with Richard trailing nervously behind her. Patricia's face immediately contorted into a mask of pure aristocratic outrage. This was an inconvenience, a failure of the help to recognize their betters. She marched forward, her heels clicking aggressively against the stone, shoving her way past the confused bridesmaids and the live-streaming cameras. She approached the head security guard, a towering, broad-shouldered man named Vance, whom I had personally briefed just hours earlier. "What is the meaning of this?" Patricia barked, her voice carrying sharply through the audio feed on my tablet. "Open these gates immediately. Do you have any idea who is in that vehicle? We are the bridal party. We are expected." Vance did not flinch. He did not step aside. He simply crossed his hands perfectly in front of him, his face a mask of polite, immovable stone. "I apologize, ma'am, but this entrance is currently restricted. We have no authorization to admit any bridal parties through the main estate gates today." The sheer absurdity of the statement caused Patricia to physically recoil. Her eyes widened, the veins in her neck protruding as her entitlement flared into furious indignation. "Restricted? What are you talking about? We paid for this venue. We rented the entire estate." She reached into her oversized designer handbag, her hands shaking with a mixture of rage and the underlying unspoken terror of her crippling financial debt. She pulled out a thick, heavy document folder. It was the VIP Priority Transfer Agreement, the multi-$100,000 contract that had successfully liquidated her retirement accounts and drained every ounce of equity my parents possessed. It was the very document that legally bound them to a strict, non-refundable trap. Patricia thrust the heavy paperwork directly into Vance's chest, waving it aggressively in his face. "Look at it! Read it!" she screamed, her voice cracking, no longer caring that half a dozen influencers were capturing her meltdown on a live broadcast. "This is a fully executed, paid-in-full contract for the exclusive use of the Azure estate today. We wired the money. It is ours. Now order your men to stand down and open these gates before I have every single one of you fired and sued for breach of contract." The situation was rapidly devolving from a fairy tale entrance into a chaotic, highly public humiliation. Brittany stood frozen by the limousine, clutching her expensive bouquet, her face draining of color as she watched her mother scream at the security detail. The influencers, realizing the drama was far more engaging than a standard wedding entrance, zoomed in on the altercation, the live-stream chats undoubtedly exploding with shock and mockery. Vance did not even look at the paperwork Patricia was violently waving at him. He maintained absolute eye contact with her, his voice remaining utterly level, projecting a terrifying calm over her frantic screaming. "Ma'am, I am intimately aware of the contract you hold." Vance stated his words, cutting cleanly through her hysteria. "Which is exactly why you are standing at the wrong entrance." The morning of the wedding arrived with a blinding crystalline sunshine that bridal magazines promised but nature rarely delivered. From the tranquil, glass-enclosed bridal suite of the royal pavilion, I sat in a plush armchair holding a steaming cup of Earl Grey tea. Resting on the marble vanity in front of me was a secure encrypted tablet streaming the live high-definition feed from the Azure Estate's main entry gates. I tapped the screen, unmuting the audio, just as Patricia's shrieking reached a fever pitch. She was waving her multi-$100,000 contract violently at my head of security, demanding entry to a venue she believed she owned. Vance, my security director, did not flinch. He did not step aside or break his immaculate, terrifyingly calm posture. He simply raised one gloved hand and pointed directly over Patricia's shoulder, past the idling stretch limousine and the swarm of confused bridesmaids, gesturing toward the opposite side of the asphalt highway. "Ma'am, you signed a lease for the West Annex project lot," Vance stated, his voice ringing with absolute clinical authority, cutting cleanly through her hysteria. "Not the Azure estate. That sector hasn't been zoned or paved yet." Patricia blinked, her mouth opening and closing silently as her brain spectacularly failed to process the sentence. She turned her head slowly. Richard turned. Brittany, standing frozen by the open door of the limousine in her stolen custom silk gown, turned. The entire flock of live-streaming influencers, sensing a pivotal, catastrophic shift in the narrative, pivoted their camera gimbals in unison. Across the two-lane road sat a sprawling, desolate expanse of land. It was cordoned off by cheap rusted chain-link fencing, the perimeter sagging under the weight of overgrown thorny weeds. The ground itself was a violently churned wasteland of deep tractor ruts, discarded wooden pallets, and sprawling pools of stagnant oily rainwater left over from the recent storms. It was an active abandoned construction site. It was a literal mud pit. Blinded by the prestigious crests, the exorbitant price tag, and the intoxicating rush of stealing, what she believed was my crowning achievement, Patricia had never engaged legal counsel to review the fine print. She had assumed the West Annex was a private garden or an elite ballroom. She had eagerly wired her entire life savings to lease a barren dirt lot designated for future plumbing excavation. The reality of the situation crashed down upon the bridal party with the force of a collapsing building. Richard staggered backward against the side of the limousine, clutching his chest, as the absolute irreversible ruin of his financial stability materialized before his eyes. He had liquidated his retirement, mortgaged his future, and bankrupted his family for a patch of wet gravel. But the true horror was unfolding just a few feet away. Brittany stepped away from the protective shadow of the vehicle. Her eyes, wide and manic, were fixed on the chain-link fence across the street. The illusion she had meticulously built over the past several months was vaporizing in real time. She had stolen Jamal's identity. She had maxed out fraudulent credit cards for the imported string quartet, the celebrity florist, and the bespoke catering. She had invited the media and the city's most ruthless social climbers to witness her ultimate victory. And her venue was a garbage dump. The influencers, realizing that this was no longer a standard wedding broadcast, but a viral, unmitigated disaster, instantly abandoned any pretense of polite friendship. They smelled blood in the water. They pushed closer, their smartphone lenses practically shoved into Brittany's face. They began narrating the catastrophe to their live audiences, their voices dripping with fake shock that barely concealed their absolute thrill. "Oh my God, you guys, the bride is locked out!" One blogger whispered loudly into her microphone, panning the camera from the towering azure gates to the mud pit across the street. They literally rented a construction site. "Look at the mud. The chat is going crazy right now. Yes, user Bella99, she is wearing a $30,000 dress to a dirt lot." Brittany heard the commentary. She spun around, her face twisting in pure panic as she realized thousands of strangers were watching her supreme humiliation broadcast live across the globe. She lunged toward the nearest influencer, batting blindly at the glowing ring light. "Turn it off!" she shrieked, her voice cracking into a desperate wail. "Stop filming me!" But the cameras only multiplied. The bridesmaids, sensing the radioactive toxicity of the situation, began backing away, whispering furiously among themselves, desperately trying to avoid the camera frames. Brittany was entirely isolated in a sea of flashing screens and digital mockery. Her breathing hitched. A high, thin wheeze escaped her chest. The crushing weight of the impending fraud charges, the looming presence of Jamal's vengeance, and the absolute destruction of her social standing collided in a violent psychological break. She stumbled backward, completely losing her spatial awareness. Her heels slipped off the manicured curb of the azure driveway and plunged into the wet, grassy shoulder of the highway. She lost her balance. The heavy imported silk of her custom gown dragged heavily through a deep, muddy puddle of runoff water, instantly absorbing the dark, oily filth. Brittany collapsed onto her knees in the damp dirt, ignoring the ruin of the dress she had stolen a man's identity to buy. She clutched at her chest, her perfectly styled hair falling into her face, as she began violently hyperventilating right there in the mud, sobbing uncontrollably while the smartphone cameras documented every agonizing second. Patricia was screeching now, a high-pitched, unintelligible wail, physically trying to block the camera lenses with her expensive handbag. But the damage was irreversible. The digital footprint of their ruin was already etched into the internet forever. Then, cutting through the chaotic symphony of Brittany's gasping sobs, Patricia's screams, and the influencer's frantic narrations, a low, powerful mechanical hum vibrated through the cobblestones beneath their feet. The crowd froze. The influencers lowered their phones, slightly pivoting their cameras back toward the estate. The massive wrought iron gates of the Azure estate, the very gates Vance had sworn were sealed for a private, highly secure event, began to slowly, majestically swing inward. The heavy steel hinges groaned softly, revealing the pristine, sun-drenched paradise hidden behind the imposing walls. The tactical security detail immediately snapped to attention, taking 2 synchronized steps backward to clear the exit path, their hands folded neatly behind their backs. From the manicured shadows of the hidden interior estate, a vehicle emerged. It was a sleek midnight black Rolls-Royce Phantom, its polished surface gleaming like dark glass in the morning sun. It moved with silent predatory grace, gliding smoothly past the barricade and rolling to a slow, deliberate halt perfectly parallel to where Brittany was currently kneeling in the mud. The tinted windows offered no immediate view of the interior, but the sheer, intimidating presence of the vehicle commanded absolute silence from the panicked crowd outside. The exhaust purred a low, threatening rhythm, a stark contrast to the absolute wreckage of my sister's shattered fairy tale. The heavy, synchronized purr of the Phantom's 12-cylinder engine dominated the sudden silence, wrapping the scene in a thick layer of mechanical intimidation. The crowd of influencers previously obsessed with Britney's muddy, hyperventilating breakdown collectively turned their lenses toward the impenetrable black glass. Slowly, with agonizing theatrical deliberation, the rear passenger window glided down. The contrast between the shadowed interior and the brilliant morning sun created a momentary veil. But as my face came into sharp focus, a literal audible gasp ripped through the assembly of onlookers. I did not look at the glowing smartphone screens. I did not look at the ruined, horrified bridesmaids clutching their blush-pink satin. I fixed my gaze entirely on my mother and my sister, letting the absolute crushing reality of their defeat wash over them in real time. A member of my private security detail, immaculate in a tailored dark suit and earpiece, stepped forward and opened the heavy rear door of the Rolls-Royce. He extended a crisp, white-gloved hand. I accepted it, stepping out onto the pristine cobblestones of the azure driveway, deliberately avoiding the filthy runoff that had just claimed Brittany's stolen gown. I was not wearing a mass-produced dress funded by fraudulent credit cards and panic. I was draped in a custom haute couture masterpiece, hand-stitched over hundreds of hours by a legendary Parisian designer, whose client list was as exclusive as it was secretive. It was a fluid silhouette of microscopic crystal embellishments and architectural silk that caught the sunlight like crushed diamonds, shimmering with every microscopic movement. The train cascaded behind me, an ocean of pristine white against the dark stone. I looked exactly as I felt, untouchable, victorious, and entirely devoid of mercy. David slid out from the opposite side of the vehicle, rounding the rear of the Phantom, to stand firmly at my side. He wore a bespoke midnight blue tuxedo that perfectly complemented the icy, regal elegance of my gown. His presence was a solid grounding force, his posture radiating a quiet, dangerous authority. He glanced across the highway at the muddy spectacle, taking in the weeping broken bride and the chaotic, buzzing crowd before turning his attention back to me. A small, fiercely proud smile touched his lips. He offered his arm, and I took it, sliding my hand through the crook of his elbow, grounding myself in the absolute reality of our shared triumph. Instantly, Vance and 3 other elite guards formed a seamless protective perimeter around us. They moved with terrifying practiced synchronization, physically separating our pristine, highly secured sanctuary from the infected, desperate chaos of my biological family. The visual contrast was staggering. On one side of the invisible boundary stood absolute cultivated power and serenity. On the other, a tragic, highly public implosion of debt, deceit, and ruin. The live-streaming influencers scrambled to capture every single angle, their cameras panning frantically between the muddy, gasping Brittany and the regal, composed bride stepping out of the Phantom vehicle. I could practically hear the viral metrics exploding across the internet as thousands of strangers tuned in to watch the carnage unfold. Patricia's shrieks had died completely in her throat the moment my window lowered. She stood frozen by the front fender of the stretch limousine, her expensive, oversized handbag hanging limply from her wrist, her mouth hanging slightly open. I watched her mind desperately try to assemble the shattered pieces of her reality. Her eyes darted wildly, She looked at my gown, her brain instantly calculating its astronomical, unattainable cost. She looked at the imposing private security detail, the massive iron gates that had swung open exclusively for me, and the breathtaking expanse of the hidden estate beyond. Then her gaze slowly dragged back across the highway to the worthless, dirt-filled, weed-infested construction lot she had just bankrupted her entire family to rent. The psychological dam finally broke. The sheer unfathomable magnitude of my manipulation penetrated her thick, lifelong shell of entitlement. She realized that I had not been defeated. I had not been crying in a cheap apartment over a stolen date. I had orchestrated a flawless, devastating counterstrike, weaponizing her own greed and Brittany's vanity to arrange their absolute destruction. A sound erupted from Patricia's chest that was entirely inhuman. It was a guttural, primal roar of absolute fury and profound world-ending humiliation. Her face contorted into a mask of pure, unadulterated hatred, all traces of her aristocratic country club composure vanishing instantly. She had spent her entire life prioritizing Brittany, punishing my independence, and attempting to crush my spirit whenever I dared to outshine her golden child. Now standing on the edge of a public highway with zero liquid assets and a ruined, fraudulent daughter, she realized I had architected her public execution with effortless, lethal precision. Her entitlement violently overpowered her common sense. "You did this!" Patricia shrieked, the sound tearing through the crisp morning air and echoing off the stone walls of the estate. "You set us up. You stole everything from your sister." She completely abandoned any pretense of dignity. Disregarding the dozen live streaming cameras, the stunned crowd, and the physical reality of the heavily armed men standing between us, she charged. Patricia lunged forward, her hands curled into desperate claws, her eyes wild with a destructive, manic rage. She wanted to physically cross the barrier. She wanted to tear the haute couture gown from my body. She wanted to physically rip the victory from my hands and drag me down into the mud with them. She did not even make it within 10 feet of me. Vance moved with blinding clinical speed, interposing his massive frame directly into her path. Two additional guards flanked him instantaneously, moving like a coordinated strike team. They caught Patricia mid-lunge, gripping her upper arms with unyielding professional force. Her forward momentum was halted so abruptly that her designer heels skidded violently against the cobblestones, her ankles twisting as she nearly went down hard onto the stone. She thrashed wildly, kicking and screaming obscenities, completely losing whatever shred of sanity she had left. "Unhand me," she wailed, spitting fury as she struggled uselessly against the immovable wall of muscle and dark fabric. "She is my daughter. I have the right to put her in her place. Let me go." The guards did not speak. They did not exert any unnecessary violence. They simply held her in place, an immovable, highly trained barrier, neutralizing a hostile, hysterical threat. Richard, finally snapping out of his catatonic shock, by the limousine rushed forward, grabbing his wife's flailing shoulders and desperately trying to pull her away from the security detail before she triggered a formal assault charge. I watched my mother thrash and scream like a cornered rabid animal, entirely unbothered by her display. I did not flinch when she lunged. I did not step behind David for protection. I simply stood there, my hand resting lightly on my future husband's arm, radiating the cold, untouchable power she had always tried to suppress. The cameras captured every single frame: the hysterical, restrained mother, the muddy, hyperventilating sister across the street, and the radiant, victorious bride looking down at them with absolute freezing indifference. The fairy tale they had tried to steal had become their permanent nightmare, and I was exactly where I belonged. The chaotic symphony of the morning momentarily died down to a sharp, breathless hush, save for the pathetic sounds of Patricia's heavy panting and the muffled wails of my sister from across the asphalt. Richard, his face an alarming shade of mottled purple, finally managed to drag his wife a few feet backward. Vance and the security team released their iron grip, simultaneously falling back into their defensive perimeter with military precision. Patricia stumbled, clutching her bruised arms, her eyes darting frantically between my immaculate couture gown and the stone-faced guards protecting me. The half-dozen influencers, recognizing the climax of a lifetime, instinctively tightened their semicircle. Their smartphone lenses were practically vibrating with the influx of thousands of live viewers. The digital chat feeds visible on the glowing screens held aloft were scrolling so fast they were a blur of shock and malicious glee. This was no longer a ruined wedding, it was a public execution. And I held the axe. I took a single deliberate step forward. The sharp click of my designer heel against the cobblestone sounded like a gunshot. David remained at my side, a silent, imposing shadow, his gaze locked on Richard to ensure the broken man made no sudden moves. "You planned this." Patricia choked out, her voice raspy and completely devoid of its usual country club arrogance. "You set us up. You stole her venue. You stole her day." I did not raise my voice. I did not need to. The ambient silence was so profound that every syllable I spoke was captured with crystal clarity by the surrounding microphones. "I stole nothing." I replied, the icy calm in my tone, a direct counter to her unhinged hysteria. "I simply allowed your greed to dig its own grave. You were so desperate to take what was mine, so entirely consumed with putting on a theatrical production to prove your superiority, that you blinded yourselves to basic reality." Richard stepped forward, his hands trembling violently as he gestured toward the locked gates behind me. "We have a contract, Melanie. A legally binding commercial contract for this estate. We paid $250,000. We wired the money." I let a slow, razor-thin smile touch my lips. It was the smile of an apex predator watching the trap snap definitively shut. "You have a contract," I agreed smoothly, projecting my voice so every single camera caught the audio. "But you do not have a contract with this venue. You have a contract with my holding company." Patricia stopped breathing. The blood completely drained from Richard's face, leaving him looking like a hollowed-out corpse. Across the road, Brittany's sobbing abruptly hitched her muddy, tear-streaked face, snapping up to look at me through the rusted chain-link fence. I locked eyes with my mother, delivering the final fatal strike. "I am the CEO and owner of the Azure. You drained your retirement to pay $250,000 for a mud pit because you were too arrogant to read the fine print. No refunds." The words landed with the devastating force of a kinetic strike. The collective gasp from the influencers was audible. One of the lifestyle bloggers actually dropped her gimbal, the expensive device clattering against the pavement, before she scrambled to retrieve it, desperate not to miss a single second of the carnage. "No," Patricia whispered, her legs finally giving out completely. She collapsed right there on the cobblestones, the expensive fabric of her mother-of-the-bride dress pooling around her like a deflated parachute. No, that is impossible. We wired the money to the West Annex Management Group. The broker said we had the premium package." "The broker worked for me," I stated coldly. "The holding company that acquired this estate 6 months ago belongs to me. The West Annex project is a future plumbing and waste management excavation site. It is exactly what you leased. You bought dirt, Patricia. You bought dirt to spite me, and you bankrupted yourselves to do it." The sheer absolute finality of their ruin settled over the driveway. Richard buried his face in his hands, a broken, wheezing sob escaping his chest as the reality of his liquidated retirement accounts and mortgaged home evaporated into the morning air. They had nothing left. They were destitute, humiliated, and legally bound to their own catastrophic stupidity. Across the highway, Brittany's temporary shock shattered, giving way to a full-blown psychological collapse. She screamed. It was a jagged, horrific sound that tore from her throat as she thrashed in the wet gravel. The heavy imported silk of her stolen gown was now caked in thick, dark sludge, completely ruined beyond repair. She crawled toward the chain-link fence, digging her manicured fingers into the muddy earth, crying and screaming at the cameras, at her parents, at the sky. The golden child, the flawless influencer, was literally rolling in the dirt, her carefully curated facade annihilated in front of an audience of millions. I watched her flail in the mud, feeling absolutely nothing. No pity, no remorse. Just the clean, sterile satisfaction of balancing a ledger that had been severely in the red for my entire life. Then the deep, throaty growl of a high-performance engine cut through Brittany's wailing. A sleek, dark obsidian Mercedes Maybach pulled off the main road, its tires crunching aggressively over the loose gravel on the shoulder. It came to a smooth, calculated halt directly behind the cluster of influencers, effectively boxing in the bridal party's ridiculous stretch limousine. The heavy doors unlocked with a sharp mechanical thud. The rear passenger door swung open, and a figure stepped out into the blinding sunlight. It was Jamal. He was not wearing the bespoke tuxedo Brittany had painstakingly picked out for their wedding day. There was no floral boutonniere, no silk bow tie, no trace of the subservient, deeply indebted groom he had pretended to be. Instead, he was wearing a sharp, dark business suit, tailored to lethal perfection. A crisp white shirt, a slate gray tie, and an aura of absolute terrifying composure radiated from him. He looked like a corporate executioner stepping onto a battlefield. He adjusted his cuffs, his movements precise and unhurried. He did not even cast a downward glance at Brittany, who was currently shrieking his name from the mud pit across the road, reaching her filthy, mud-caked hands out toward him through the rusted fence. He treated her entire existence as utterly irrelevant. Instead, Jamal walked with deliberate, measured steps directly into the center of the flashing cameras and ring lights. He stopped adjusting his posture so he was perfectly framed by the live streaming lenses. The influencers, practically vibrating with the adrenaline of this new twist, pointed their microphones toward him in stunned silence. Jamal looked dead into the center lens of the nearest camera, his expression completely void of emotion. He did not smile. He did not frown. He simply delivered his line with the chilling precision of a man who had just dismantled an empire. That's not even the worst part. The silence that followed Jamal's declaration was absolute, broken only by the frantic tapping of smartphone screens and the ragged, pathetic gasps coming from the mud pit across the highway. The influencers, their eyes wide with predatory excitement, thrust their microphones closer. The digital viewership numbers in the corner of their streaming devices skyrocketed as the internet collectively held its breath, sensing the ultimate kill shot. Jamal did not raise his voice. He did not need to. He reached inside the breast pocket of his tailored jacket and withdrew a thick, heavy manila folder. The clasp snapped open with a sharp, definitive click that seemed to echo across the cobblestone driveway. He held the thick stack of papers up to the glaring light of the morning sun. 6 months ago, Jamal began his tone carrying the clinical, detached precision of an auditor presenting a terminal balance sheet. Brittany came to me in tears. She claimed we were expecting a child. She used the promise of a family to expedite a legal binding presenting stolen sonogram images downloaded from the internet and fabricating elaborate medical appointments. She demanded immediate access to my private accounts to secure a home, a nursery, and a premium level of prenatal care for our supposed baby. I was fully prepared to provide for that future. He paused, his dark eyes sweeping over the crowd of live streaming cameras, entirely ignoring the wretched bride who was currently clawing at the chain-link fence, sobbing his name in a desperate muddy heap. However, Jamal continued, his voice dropping an octave, radiating a lethal chill. I am not a man who invests blindly. I require verification. He pulled the first set of documents from the folder. The crisp white pages bore the unmistakable embossed crest of the city's premier women's health clinic. He turned the documents outward, displaying them directly to the unblinking lenses of the influencer brigade. These are certified medical records obtained through a private investigation and legally verified, Jamal stated. They confirm that Brittany underwent a voluntary surgical procedure 5 years ago that renders natural conception completely biologically impossible. There is no baby. There never was a baby. The entire pregnancy was a calculated, malicious fabrication engineered solely to trap me into funding her hollow parasitic lifestyle. A collective audible gasp ripped through the audience. The bridesmaids, still huddled by the stretch limousine, covered their mouths in genuine horror. The influencers exchanged wild, ecstatic glances, their live chats moving so fast The text blurred into a solid white stream of shock and mockery. Across the highway, Brittany let out a shrill, piercing scream, burying her face in the wet dirt, unable to conjure a single lie to counter the stark, printed reality held in Jamal's hand. But the execution was far from over. Jamal seamlessly swapped the medical files for a thick stack of bank logs, credit card statements, and wire transfer receipts. He held them up, his gaze locking onto Patricia, who was currently slumped against the front tire of the limousine, her face the color of wet ash. Once she believed she had secured her target, the extraction began. Jamal announced, his voice slicing through the crisp air. He began listing the figures with brutal, unforgiving clarity. $200,000 siphoned from my business accounts under the guise of an investment in a phantom charity routed directly into her personal offshore holding. $75,000 charged to a fraudulently obtained credit card in my name for the celebrity florist. $50,000 for the bespoke catering. She stole my identity, bypassed my security protocols, and maxed out 4 separate elite credit lines just to purchase the gown she is currently wearing in that ditch. He dropped the papers back into the folder, the heavy thud of the documents sealing her fate. She did not want a marriage. She wanted an ATM, and she was not working alone. Jamal turned his full, terrifying attention to Richard and Patricia. Richard physically shrank, his broad shoulders collapsing inward as if he were trying to fold himself out of existence. Patricia shook her head frantically, her lips moving, but no sound emerged. The parents of the bride Jamal projected, ensuring the microphones picked up every syllable. The architects of this pathetic illusion. They parade around the country club, looking down on the working class pretending to possess generational wealth. But their reality is a house of cards built on massive, insurmountable debt. He pulled out a final set of papers, brandishing them like a sword. These are public records, court filings, and bank liens. Richard's logistics firm has not posted a profit in 3 years. It is quietly, effectively bankrupt. Their primary residence, the estate they brag about, is heavily triple mortgaged and currently 6 months deep into the pre-foreclosure process. The luxury vehicles they drove here today are leased and currently flagged for repossession. They possess 0 liquid assets. Their pristine social standing is a hallucination funded by predatory lenders. Jamal stepped closer to the cameras, his eyes burning with righteous, cold vengeance. They were entirely complicit in Brittany's fraud. They knew about the fake pregnancy. They knew about the stolen identity. They encouraged it because snaring a wealthy target was their absolute last desperate gamble to avoid total financial ruin. They pawned their own daughter off as a grifter to pay their overdue country club dues. The destruction was absolute. The facade of the perfect wealthy elite family was annihilated, in real time obliterated down to the atomic level. There was nowhere to hide. The carefully curated image Patricia had spent decades ruthlessly protecting was stripped away, exposing them as destitute, parasitic con artists in front of the exact high society audience they had sacrificed everything to impress. Patricia buried her face in her hands, a long, agonizing moan escaping her throat as she slid the rest of the way down the side of the car, collapsing onto the hard cobblestones. Richard stood frozen, staring blankly at the ground. A ruined man stripped of his pride, his money, and his reputation. Jamal closed the folder, adjusting his jacket one final time. He looked directly into the primary camera lens, his expression calm and utterly resolved. "I cancel the engagement," he stated, his voice ringing with absolute finality. "I have already filed comprehensive fraud and grand larceny charges with the district attorney. The authorities are currently waiting at your foreclosed home. Have a wonderful day." Without a single backward glance, Jamal turned on his heel. He walked smoothly back to the Obsidian. Maybach slid into the rear passenger seat, and the heavy door slammed shut with a definitive hollow boom. The sleek vehicle reversed smoothly, gliding out of the estate entrance and disappearing down the winding road, leaving the wreckage of my biological family entirely exposed to the merciless digital world. The sleek vehicle had barely merged onto the shoulder of the winding road when the brake lights flared a brilliant sudden red. The heavy engine idled, a low, menacing purr vibrating through the pavement. The crowd of influencers, still frantically narrating the unprecedented carnage into their phones, paused their rapid-fire commentary. Across the asphalt, Brittany's hysterical sobbing hitched. She scrambled upright in the sludge, her ruined dress heavy with thick dark mud, a desperate, delusional spark of hope illuminating her tear-streaked face. She thought he was coming back for her. She thought her tears had finally broken through his clinical detachment. The rear door of the Maybach swung open once more. Jamal stepped out, his posture radiating an even colder, more absolute finality than before. He did not rush. He crossed the highway with the measured, predatory grace of a man tying up the very last loose end of a severed liability. The security team parted seamlessly to let him pass, recognizing the absolute authority in his stride. He stopped at the edge of the rusted chain-link fence, staring down into the waterlogged ditch where my sister knelt in the filth. Brittany reached through the diamond-shaped gaps in the wire, her hands trembling violently. Her manicured nails were chipped and caked with wet earth. She opened her mouth, babbling a pathetic stream of apologies, bargaining, and desperate pleas, completely abandoning any remaining shred of her carefully constructed dignity. Jamal simply stood there, letting her degrade herself in front of a live audience of millions. He reached into his trouser pocket and slowly withdrew a small black velvet box. Brittany's eyes locked onto it, widening with a manic, feverish desperation. With a fluid, deliberate motion, Jamal flipped the lid open. Inside rested the 5-carat flawless diamond engagement ring she had spent months flaunting across every social media platform she possessed. It caught the morning sunlight, flashing with a brilliant, mocking fire. "You are nothing but a fraud," Jamal stated, his voice carrying the lethal, quiet force of a judge delivering a death sentence. "And your family is a rotting mess." He did not hand the box through the fence. He did not toss it to her. He simply tilted his hand, letting the magnificent multi-million-dollar diamond slip from its velvet cushion. It plummeted downward, striking the edge of the asphalt, before bouncing directly into the deepest, thickest puddle of stagnant mud at Brittany's knees. The heavy ring vanished instantly into the dark sludge with a soft, sickening plop. Without another word, Jamal turned and walked back to his waiting vehicle. This time the Maybach did not stop. It accelerated smoothly down the highway, carrying him out of her life forever. Brittany let out a feral, gut-wrenching shriek and plunged her bare hands into the freezing mud. She dug frantically, her arms submerged to the elbows, weeping hysterically as she sifted through the dirt and rocks, desperately trying to unearth the only valuable asset she had left. Patricia, finally snapping out of her catatonic shock, scrambled to her feet and hobbled toward the ditch to help her golden child dig through the filth. They were literally wallowing in the gutter, two women who had built their entire identities on the illusion of superiority, now reduced to plunging their hands into sewage. Then a new sound pierced the morning air. It started as a faint, high-pitched wail in the distance, rapidly growing louder and more urgent. The distinct rising and falling shriek of police sirens cut through the chaos, echoing off the stone walls of my estate. Vance stepped up to my side, his earpiece glowing faintly in the sunlight. "Local law enforcement is 2 minutes out, ma'am," Vance reported, his voice devoid of inflection. "We flagged them for trespassing, public disturbance, and attempted fraud regarding the venue access. They are responding with multiple units." Richard's head snapped up. The reality of the approaching sirens triggered a new wave of panic in his eyes. He looked at his wife and daughter covered in mud and frantically digging, and then he looked at the flashing lights cresting the hill down the highway. The absolute, inescapable consequences of their actions were descending upon them. I stood perfectly still, letting the entire scene imprint itself permanently onto my memory. The wailing sirens, the frantic, muddy scrambling of my mother and sister, the broken posture of the father who had enabled them both. They were reaping exactly what they had sown. There was no joy in my heart, but there was a profound, unshakable peace. The ledger was finally permanently balanced. The poison that had infected my life for decades had been expertly extracted and neutralized. David shifted his weight, his presence a solid, comforting anchor at my side. He offered his hand. I looked up at him, my husband, my partner, the man who had helped me orchestrate this flawless victory. I placed my hand in his, interlacing our fingers. The warmth of his touch chased away the lingering chill of my past. I turned my back on the highway. I did not offer a parting word. I did not gloat. Silence was the ultimate weapon, and indifference was the final execution. With David by my side, I began the walk up the pristine, sunlit cobblestone driveway, moving toward the breathtaking expanse of the azure and the beautiful, meticulously planned future waiting for us inside. Behind me, Patricia screamed my name, a frantic, desperate command, demanding I stop, demanding I save them from the approaching police cruisers. I did not break my stride. I did not turn my head. As we crossed the threshold of the property line, Vance signaled the security team. The massive wrought iron gates, standing 20 feet tall and forged from impenetrable black steel, began to move. Their heavy hinges groaned softly as they swung inward, the electronic motors humming with quiet power. I heard the chaotic shouting from the road grow muffled, drowned out by the mechanical finality of the closing barrier. The gates met in the center with a resounding heavy clang that echoed across the estate. The heavy deadbolts engaged with a sharp metallic thud, physically and metaphorically, sealing them out of my world forever. The past was locked away and my new life had finally begun. The heavy thud of the iron gates locking behind me served as the final punctuation mark on a 30-year sentence. The harsh, panicked shouts and the wailing sirens were instantly muffled, replaced by the serene, absolute quiet of the azure estate. David squeezed my hand, a silent reassurance, as we walked up the sweeping limestone pathway together. The air inside the grounds smelled of blooming jasmine and crisp morning dew, completely untouched by the exhaust mud and despair polluting the highway. We approached the grand entrance of the Royal Pavilion. It was an architectural marvel of glass-white marble and cascading greenery designed to seamlessly blend modern luxury with the natural beauty of the estate. As the massive mahogany doors swung open to receive us, a wave of warmth and soft ambient light washed over my face. The contrast was staggering. Outside those walls lay a graveyard of deceit, toxic entitlement, and bankrupt ambitions. Inside, an oasis of truth, elegance, and genuine devotion awaited. I took a brief moment in the bridal suite, a gorgeous sun-drenched room overlooking the private lake, to let the adrenaline of the morning finally subside. My reflection in the floor-to-ceiling mirror showed no traces of the battle that had just concluded. The bespoke couture gown was pristine, the microscopic crystal embellishments catching the light with a calm, steady brilliance. There was absolutely no guilt weighing on my chest. There was no remorse knotting my stomach. For the first time in my entire existence, I was completely unburdened. The emotional leeches that had drained my spirit, constantly demanding my sacrifice to fuel their delusions, were gone. They had been severed by their own greed. A gentle knock at the door signaled it was time. I stepped out into the grand atrium. The royal pavilion had been transformed into a breathtaking sanctuary. Thousands of white orchids and trailing wisteria cascaded from the vaulted glass ceiling, creating a living canopy of breathtaking beauty. A string quartet played a soft, sweeping melody that filled the acoustic perfection of the hall. The morning sun poured through the massive windows, bathing the white marble floors in a warm, ethereal glow. As the music swelled to signal my entrance, the heavy silk curtains parted, and I stepped into the aisle. The faces that turned to greet me were not filled with jealousy, silent judgment, or calculated expectation. There were no country club socialites whispering behind their hands. There was no Patricia aggressively calculating the cost of the floral arrangements, no Richard networking for his failing business, no Brittany pouting and posing for a camera. Instead, I was met with a sea of warm, genuine smiles. David's family and our closest friends filled the pristine white chairs. His parents, sitting in the front row, beamed at me with unreserved affection and immense pride. His mother, an elegant woman with kind, expressive eyes, pressed a hand to her heart, her face radiant with happy tears. These were people who knew the real me, who had welcomed me into their lives, not because of what I could provide for them, but because of who I was. They had offered me the unconditional love, respect, and safety that my biological family had actively and maliciously withheld. At the end of the aisle stood David, The dangerous, commanding aura he had projected at the gates had melted away, replaced by an expression of profound, soul-deep tenderness. He looked at me as if I were the only person in the universe, his dark eyes shining with an overwhelming mixture of love and triumph. Every step I took toward him felt like shedding a heavy, invisible chain. Walking down that aisle, surrounded by the sweet fragrance of orchids and the gentle harmony of strings, the poetic justice of the moment struck me with profound clarity. Just a few hundred yards away, on the other side of a thick stone wall and impenetrable steel, my biological family was facing the brutal, humiliating destruction they had engineered for themselves. I could almost picture the flashing blue and red lights painting the muddy ditch, the heavy handcuffs clicking shut over Richard's wrists, as the fraud and grand larceny charges were executed. I envisioned the absolute social annihilation of Patricia's precious reputation as she was loaded into the back of a police cruiser. And Brittany, stripped of her fake wealth, her stolen venue, and her wealthy target, was now facing a future of crushing debt, criminal complicity, and permanent public infamy. They were drowning in the rot they had cultivated for decades. But their ruin could not touch me here. The walls of the royal pavilion were an impenetrable fortress of peace. I did not look back. I kept my eyes locked entirely on David, the man who had stood by my side and helped me build an empire of truth and boundaries. As I reached the altar, he reached out, taking both of my hands in his. His touch was warm, grounding, and infinitely safe. The fairy tale my sister and mother had tried so desperately to steal had never actually been about the expensive venue, the designer dress, or the money. It was about this exact moment. It was about standing beside someone who loved you fiercely, honestly, and without condition. As the officiant began to speak, his voice wrapping us in the sacred ancient words of commitment, I looked out at the beautiful family I had chosen. I knew with absolute certainty that I had finally found my way home, leaving the ghosts of my past buried in the mud exactly where they belonged. The applause that thundered through the royal pavilion as David and I shared our first kiss as husband and wife was deafening, a wave of pure, unadulterated joy that washed over us. The transition from the serene emotional ceremony to the vibrant reception was a masterclass in event design executed flawlessly by my team. Waitstaff in crisp, tailored white jackets circulated effortlessly with silver trays of vintage champagne and delicate Michelin star hors d'oeuvres. The grand ballroom, illuminated by a dozen cascading crystal chandeliers, felt like a universe entirely detached from the grim, muddy reality I had left out on the highway. We took to the center of the polished marble dance floor, moving smoothly to a live jazz rendition of our favorite song. Every face looking back at me radiated genuine happiness. There were no hushed, toxic whispers of judgment, no calculating glares evaluating the cost of the floral centerpieces, and no desperate attempts to steal the spotlight. For the first time in my life, I was celebrating a milestone without bracing for an inevitable, malicious disruption. When David took the microphone for his toast, the room fell into a respectful, loving silence. He spoke of my resilience, my corporate vision, and the empire I had built from the ashes of constant lifelong underestimation. He did not mention my biological family by name, but his promise to fiercely protect our peace was a vow that resonated deep within my bones. We feasted on a 7-course culinary masterpiece, laughed with friends who truly valued our presence, and celebrated until the stars burned brightly above the glass ceiling. It was the exact opposite of the tacky, heavily indebted circus Patricia had tried to orchestrate. It was perfect because it was authentic, paid for in full by my own success, and shared with people who mattered. Hours before dawn, we slipped away from the estate, leaving the lingering magic of the reception behind us. A private jet waited on the tarmac of the executive airport, ready to whisk us away from the chill of the city to the equatorial warmth of the Indian Ocean. The flight was a seamless blur of top-tier service and exhausted, blissful sleep in the private cabin. When we finally stepped off the chartered seaplane and onto the wooden docks of our private island in the Maldives, the sheer, breathtaking beauty of the sanctuary took my breath away. Our accommodation was an exclusive overwater bungalow, a marvel of tropical architecture suspended above crystal-clear turquoise water. It came equipped with a private infinity plunge pool, a dedicated staff, and a glass floor lounge that revealed the vibrant, colorful marine life darting through the coral below. For the next 2 weeks, the world outside our villa ceased to exist. I deliberately disconnected completely, leaving my work phones, tablets, and business laptops powered down and locked securely inside the suite's heavy steel safe. We spent our mornings swimming in the warm, salty ocean, exploring untouched reefs right off the steps of our private deck. Our afternoons melted away under the tropical sun, lounging on pristine white sand beaches, with absolutely nothing but the sound of the gentle surf to occupy our minds. We enjoyed private candlelit dinners on the shoreline, the sand cool beneath our bare feet, as we drank imported wine and talked endlessly about our future, the expansion of our holding company, and the beautiful life we were building together. The heavy, suffocating anxiety that had plagued my entire childhood, the constant, exhausting need to anticipate and deflect my mother's cruelty or my sister's calculated sabotage, was completely gone. I felt incredibly light, as if a physical weight had been surgically removed from my chest. David and I were in total alignment, our bond fortified by the absolute fire we had walked through to secure this peace. We indulged in couples massages at the island spa, sailed on a private catamaran at sunset, and simply reveled in the quiet, undisturbed sanctuary of each other's company. This was absolute, unadulterated bliss. The universe had finally granted me the reprieve I had fought so ruthlessly to earn, and I savored every single second of it. But reality, no matter how firmly locked away, always demands to be eventually acknowledged. On the morning of our final day in paradise, the illusion of our isolated bubble finally cracked. We were sitting on our private deck sipping espresso and watching our last Maldivian sunrise paint the sky in brilliant shades of pink and gold. I decided it was time to briefly reconnect with the digital world, to arrange our return logistics, and check in with my executive team at the Azure. I walked inside, opened the safe, and retrieved my personal smartphone. The device had been off for 14 days. The moment I held the power button, the screen illuminated and the device violently vibrated to life. A relentless cascade of notifications instantly flooded the screen, buzzing so rapidly the phone nearly slipped from my palm. There were dozens of missed calls from unknown local numbers, frantic voicemails, and an alarming number of Google News alerts tagging my maiden name. I ignored the chaotic noise, my thumb swiping past the barrage of alerts, navigating straight to my private email inbox to look for my assistant's daily briefing. Instead, my eyes locked onto a message sitting at the very top of the queue. It was marked with a red high-priority exclamation point and had been sent just an hour prior. The sender name made the warm tropical breeze suddenly feel freezing cold. It was Richard. I opened the email, the bright screen glaring against the soft morning light filtering into the bungalow. The text was uncharacteristically brief, entirely stripped of his usual pompous arrogance, and radiated a pathetic, absolute desperation. I read the words twice, letting the sheer magnitude of his total collapse sink in. The bank is foreclosing on our house. Your mother had a panic attack and is in the hospital. Brittany is ruined. Please, you have to save us. I stared at the glowing screen of my phone, the pathetic, frantic text of Richard's desperate email reflecting in my eyes. Beside me, on the sun-drenched deck of our Maldivian bungalow, David noticed the sudden shift in the atmosphere. He leaned over his shoulder, brushing mine, and read the brief, hysterical message. He did not ask how I felt or what I intended to do. He simply waited for my lead, his presence an unwavering pillar of support. I locked the screen and tossed the device onto the bamboo table. The tropical sun continued to rise over the Indian Ocean, painting the sky in brilliant hues of violet and gold, and our final day in paradise proceeded exactly as planned. We swam in the crystal-clear water, enjoyed a private dinner on the beach, and completely ignored the self-inflicted ruin consuming the people who shared my DNA. Their crisis was not my emergency. 2 days later, we returned to the crisp, bustling energy of the city. I was back in my element, stepping off my private elevator and into the expansive glass-walled executive suite of my corporate headquarters. The city skyline stretched out below me, a vast concrete and steel kingdom over which I now held absolute dominion. My office was a fortress of polished marble, rich mahogany, and commanding views designed to project authority and unshakable power. It was here, in the very heart of my empire, that I had agreed to host one final strictly controlled meeting. It was not out of pity nor a lingering sense of obligation. It was a necessary surgical closure of a toxic chapter, a final sealing of the vault. My executive assistant, a sharply dressed woman with an iron demeanor, knocked once before opening the heavy double doors. She stepped aside, and my biological family was escorted inside by two massive, unsmiling security personnel. The transformation was absolutely staggering. They looked physically diminished, as if the suffocating weight of their lies and debts had literally crushed their spines. Richard, who had spent his entire life projecting the aura of a powerful, wealthy patriarch, looked like a hollow, terrified shell. His expensive suit hung loosely on his shrinking frame, the fabric wrinkled and unkempt. His face was drawn, his skin a sickly ashen gray, and his hands trembled visibly at his sides. Patricia, fresh from her hospital stay following her panic attack, was utterly devoid of her usual immaculate country club grooming. Her hair was flat and lifeless, her posture hunched, and her eyes darted nervously around the intimidating expanse of my office. She looked intimidated by the sheer scale of the success she had spent years trying to belittle and suppress. But it was Brittany who had suffered the most spectacular, catastrophic collapse. The golden child, the flawless internet personality, looked entirely destroyed. She wore a faded, oversized sweatshirt and dark sunglasses that she nervously removed, revealing puffy, deeply bruised eyes, heavily underscored by dark bags. The internet, a merciless entity that feasts on hypocrisy, had utterly annihilated her. Jamal's brutal, legally verified exposure of her fake pregnancy, combined with the detailed list of her massive financial grifts, had gone viral within minutes of his speech. The digital backlash had been biblical. Every single sponsor had dropped her. Bridal brands issued public statements explicitly disavowing any connection to her. Her management agency had publicly severed all ties. Her social media accounts, once a highly curated stream of fake luxury and unearned adoration, were flooded with hundreds of thousands of vitriolic mocking comments, forcing her to scrub her digital footprint entirely. She was digitally radioactive, a social pariah stripped of the only currency she had ever valued. They stood awkwardly on the plush, hand-tufted carpet of my office, shrinking under my cold, silent gaze. I remained seated behind my expansive desk, my hands folded perfectly on the polished wood, projecting nothing but absolute terrifying calm. I did not offer them a seat. I did not offer them a greeting. I let the heavy, suffocating silence stretch until the tension in the room became unbearable. Richard broke first. His voice trembled, stripped of every ounce of its former arrogance and commanding bluster. He stepped forward, his hands shaking as he gripped the edge of my desk, his knuckles turning white. He began to beg. He babbled incoherently about the bank freezing their checking accounts, the heavy foreclosure notices taped to their front door, and the total, inescapable reality of their impending bankruptcy. He spoke of predatory lenders circling them like vultures, of credit lines being instantly severed, and of a lifetime of curated social standing vanishing overnight. Patricia joined in, weeping openly, her tears leaving harsh, wet streaks down her pale face. She invoked the sacred bonds of family, sobbing hysterically about blood loyalty and the unconditional forgiveness a daughter fundamentally owed her mother. She cried out that they had made mistakes, that they had been blinded by stress, but that they still loved me. It was a pathetic, transparent display of manipulation, a desperate attempt to weaponize the very concepts they had relentlessly violated for decades. She begged me to remember the good times, completely ignoring the fact that those good times had only ever existed for her and Brittany. Then the ultimate degradation occurred. Richard's knees visibly buckled. He sank to the floor, grasping at the air, literally begging me to save them. Patricia followed, collapsing beside him, clutching her designer purse to her chest as she wailed in raw, unfiltered panic. Even Brittany, completely broken and devoid of any lingering pride, slid to the carpet, tears streaming down her face, her shoulders shaking with silent sobs. They were on their knees in my office, a wretched, desperate trio, pleading for the exact sum they had tried to steal from me. They begged for the $250,000 venue refund. It was their absolute last hope, the only remaining lifeline they believed could briefly delay their total financial annihilation. They cried out my name, begging for mercy, promising that things would be radically different, swearing that they had finally learned their lesson. They offered to sign contracts to publicly apologize, to do whatever I demanded if only I would wire the money into their accounts and save them from the ruin they had so ruthlessly engineered for themselves. I watched them grovel. For so many agonizing years, I had genuinely believed that seeing them reduced to this wretched state would ignite a fiery, vindictive joy inside me. I had always assumed that watching my abusers beg for my mercy would be a deeply euphoric, triumphant experience. But staring down at Richard, Patricia, and Brittany as they wept openly onto the pristine, hand-tufted wool carpet of my corporate headquarters, I felt absolutely nothing. There was no triumph, no malice, and certainly no lingering pity. There was only a profound clinical emptiness. They were no longer the terrifying, omnipotent figures that had dominated my childhood nightmares. They were just three desperate, pathetic strangers drowning in the inevitable consequences of their own toxic choices. Richard's hands clawed at the polished edge of my mahogany desk, his tear-streaked face tilted upward in a grotesque, humiliating mask of supplication. He muttered broken, incoherent promises of repayment, offering me equity in a logistics firm that we both knew was completely, hopelessly insolvent. Patricia continued to wail, her expensive makeup running in dark, muddy rivers down her pale cheeks, loudly invoking the sacred concept of a mother's love. She weaponized the very phrase she had historically used to keep me small, isolated, and obedient. Beside them, Brittany remained slumped in a miserable heap of faded fabric and shattered ego, completely stripped of her digital armor, paralyzed by the sheer magnitude of her public cancellation and absolute sponsor abandonment. I did not flinch. I did not offer a single comforting word or a sympathetic nod. I simply sat perfectly still, letting their frantic, pathetic chorus echo off the marble walls of my office, allowing the absolute futility of their performance to settle into the quiet, conditioned air. Slowly, with deliberate, measured grace, I reached toward the sleek silver tray resting on the corner of my desk. I picked up a single crisp sheet of heavy stock paper. It was not a bank draft. It was not a wire transfer confirmation. It was a formal document printed with the immaculate embossed letterhead of the Azure Estate Management Division. I pressed 2 fingers against the top edge of the thick paper and slid it smoothly across the gleaming mahogany surface. The crisp friction of the paper sliding against the wood was the only sound I made. It stopped exactly inches from Richard's trembling fingertips. The weeping abruptly ceased. A desperate, delusional spark of salvation ignited in Richard's bloodshot eyes. He lunged for the paper, his hands shaking so violently the heavy sheet rattled in his grip. Patricia scrambled closer on her knees, her tear-filled eyes wide with the desperate, absolute hope that her ultimate gamble had paid off, that her discarded daughter had finally cracked under the pressure of familial guilt and offered them financial salvation. Brittany lifted her head, holding her breath in the suffocating silence. I watched the exact second the delusion permanently shattered. Richard's eyes darted across the immaculate black text. The faint flush of hope drained rapidly from his face, leaving his skin a ghastly, translucent gray. His mouth opened, but his vocal cords completely failed him. The paper slipped from his nerveless grasp, fluttering back onto the desk like a dead leaf. Patricia snatched it up instantly, her manicured fingers gripping the edges as her eyes scanned the itemized lines. A sharp, strangled gasp tore from her throat, quickly morphing into a sound of pure, unadulterated horror. "It is an invoice," I stated, my voice slicing through the heavy silence with the cold precision of a surgical blade. $15,000. I leaned back in my leather executive chair, clasping my hands together and resting them in my lap. I listed the charges with detached administrative clarity. $5,000 for the deployment of the elite tactical security personnel required to manage the public disturbance you caused at my private gates. $3,000 for the coordination with local law enforcement to process your trespassing and attempted fraud charges. And $7,000 for the specialized hazardous waste removal team hired to pressure wash the mud and filth from my pristine cobblestone driveway and wrought iron fencing. Brittany let out a hollow, broken whimper, burying her face in her hands as the reality of her total destruction washed over her. Patricia dropped the invoice, staring at me as if I had suddenly transformed into an alien creature she could not comprehend. "You came into my sanctuary," I continued, my tone dropping to a quiet, lethal register. "You attempted to steal a multi-million-dollar venue through blatant identity theft. You dragged the merciless digital world to my doorstep and polluted my property with your spectacular, unhinged collapse. Every action carries a cost. You wanted a transaction today. This is your final balance. But we have nothing." Richard wheezed, his broad shoulders collapsing inward as he fell back onto his heels, staring blankly at the ceiling. "The bank has frozen everything. The lenders are taking the house. We cannot pay this. We cannot pay anything." I looked down at the man who had spent my entire life evaluating my worth based purely on what I could provide for his golden child. "That sounds like a profound personal failure, Richard," I replied smoothly, devoid of a single ounce of empathy. "I suggest you consult your bankruptcy attorney regarding liquidation options. My accounting department expects payment in full within 30 days. Standard corporate terms apply." Patricia scrambled forward on her knees, her hands reaching out as if to grab the fabric of my skirt. "Melanie, please," she sobbed, her voice cracking with raw, unhinged hysteria. "You cannot do this. We are your family. We share the same blood. You have to forgive us. You have to save us." I looked at the woman who had birthed me, feeling the very last microscopic thread connecting us snap completely and permanently. I stood up. The movement was slow, fluid, and deliberate. Standing at my full height, I towered over them, a woman in absolute control of her environment, her immense wealth, and her destiny. I looked down at the three of them, kneeling pathetic and broken in the wreckage of their own lifelong deceit. "When I needed a family, you told me there was no space for me," I said, delivering the words with a calm, cinematic finality that resonated in the very marrow of my bones. "Now in my empire there is no space for you." I did not wait for a response or another tearful plea. I raised my hand and signaled to the massive security operatives standing silently by the mahogany double doors. They moved with terrifying practiced efficiency. In seconds they had hauled Richard and Patricia to their feet, completely ignoring their frantic protests and pathetic wails. Another guard stepped in, lifting the catatonic, ruined Brittany by her arms. They were marched out of my office, a disgraceful, humiliating procession of ruined grifters being permanently expelled from the sanctuary they had tried to exploit. The heavy mahogany doors swung shut behind them, the solid, authoritative click of the latch sealing their fate forever. The frantic noise of their exit faded instantly, replaced by the perfect insulated silence of my executive suite. I was entirely alone. I turned away from the desk and walked slowly across the plush carpet, stopping at the edge of the massive floor-to-ceiling windows. The afternoon sun bathed the room in a brilliant golden warmth. Below me, the sprawling metropolis stretched out to the horizon, a glittering kingdom of steel glass and endless opportunity over which I held dominion. The sky above was a flawless, unbroken blue. I stood there bathed in the light, feeling the steady, powerful rhythm of my own heartbeat. There was no fear left. There was no lingering shadow of the past holding me back. I looked out over the city skyline, entirely free, powerful, and at peace. The story teaches a profound lesson about self-worth. True power lies in establishing unbreakable boundaries. For years, the protagonist endured conditional love and malicious exploitation from those who should have protected her. Her ultimate triumph wasn't just building a financial empire, but realizing she owed her abusers absolutely nothing. By refusing to finance their self-inflicted ruin, she protected her peace and permanently reclaimed her narrative. Sometimes the bravest thing you can do is walk away from people who only value you for what they can extract. Take a moment to evaluate your own boundaries, share your experiences, and comment below.